Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, and I have a guest today. Returning to the show is Adam Berger. Adam, how are you doing today?
Good, Jesse. How are you?
Did I just mispronounce your last name? Is it Berger?
You did. You did. It's Berger, but it's okay. I'm used to it. Happens
Damn,
all the time.
things that you should definitely ask off air. Instead, we had a 5 minute discussion about how far away certain places in New York State are from Massachusetts. But um, welcome back, everyone. And so Adam is joining us because Adam, like myself, is a very passionate fan of the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. We have had many discussions online about this. Pretty much it's Hall of Fame season, but it really never stops. Hall of Fame season never stops if you're really into it. It's discussed 365 days a year. So what I wanted to do is I told Adam to come up with a list of 5 candidates on the ballot, and they can be on the ballot in any category. They can be, I guess I should explain what the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame is to people who aren't familiar with it, who might be listening to the show. But so the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame is a Hall of Fame created by Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer Newsletter. And it is a Hall of Fame for wrestlers, but also contains non-wrestlers, managers, promoters, TV announcers, trainers, basically anyone that can be associated in the wrestling industry. And it's been voted on every year since 1997. There was a large inaugural class in 1996, which inducted all of or most of the no-brainer candidates. But every year it's voted on by members of the media. It's voted on by active wrestlers, retired wrestlers, other people associated with wrestling, historians. I'm fortunate enough to have a ballot. Adam has told me he does not have a ballot, which is wrong, and we're going to work on that. It's all about just oiling up Dave just right to get him to send you the ballot each year. But every year we vote. There are 5 categories that you can vote in. There is a historical performers category, which is all wrestlers who it's kind of a loose definition because people's careers are different, but it's basically if you stopped being a headliner 30 years ago or later, you're in the historical district category. So anyone who stopped being a main eventer after 1992 is in the modern category, and anyone who stopped being a main eventer before 1992 is in the historical category. So there's the historical category, there's the modern category. There's also separate categories for Japan and Mexico. There is the Europe and Australia category. And of course, there is the non-wrestler category. And so there's a big list. I'm not going to go over the whole ballot on air because that sounds ridiculous, but there's a big list of candidates. You can vote for up to, I believe, 8 candidates this year in each category, and 18 total, and you don't have to vote in every category. For instance, I don't vote in the Europe and rest of the world category, nor do I vote in the Mexico category because I don't feel like my knowledge is strong enough to have an informed opinion on some of those performers. But it's really interesting. It's a fun exercise every year. It really doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter who's in and who's out. Ultimately, it doesn't really change lives or anything like that, but it is, in my opinion, the best of the Hall of Fames that exist in pro wrestling, and certainly the one with the clearest and cleanest voting system. But what I wanted to do as an exercise today was I told Adam, pick 5 candidates. They can be in any category. They can be historical. They can be non-wrestlers. They can be in Japan. Doesn't matter. Pick 5 candidates that you think have the most intriguing arguments about them. It's not necessarily people you'd vote for, because some of the people I chose are people that I don't think I'm going to be voting for this year, but just people that have really interesting cases, because some people have more interesting cases than others. And I didn't want to just go down a list of, like, hey, Adam, like, what do you think about Enrique Torres? And like hope that Adam has something to say about Enrique Torres. There's a lot of people on this
I do
ballot.
not.
Yeah, there's a lot of people on this ballot, especially in like the historical performers era, that I don't have anything to say about them. Like, I know who Archie Goldie is. I know that he was a big draw in Tennessee and a big draw in Calgary, but I really don't have a strong opinion on him either way. So we're just going to ignore him for the most part, unless that's one of your fascinating candidates, Adam. We don't know which one we're choosing. We could have the same ones. So I told Adam I had a little surprise for him, but he asked us how we were going to format this. And I was going to say, I'm going to ask you a trivia question, Adam. And if you get it right, you can go first. And if you get it wrong, I will go first. And I'll give you 15 seconds to answer it. But It's very
Okay.
simple. In the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, alphabetically, who is the first candidate? Or who's the first person in the Hall of Fame alphabetically?
Antonio Inoki?
Nope. It's Abdullah the Butcher. Thanks for playing.
Ah, I should have known that. That's
Yeah.
good.
No, it's good. I mean, you just think of someone with an A, right? And then go with it. I think and Inoki's got to be up there close to the top. Andre the Giant also would be a close one. Antonio Rocca is another A name. Anyway, so I'll go first. And so my first candidate is I'm going to go with somebody who is certainly going to be very divisive this year and has been divisive pretty much for their entire career, and that's Roman Reigns. And so I'll put this forth as Roman Reigns. So earlier this year, someone asked me if I would be voting for Roman Reigns this year on the ballot. And I said, unless something dramatically changes where it's very clear that Roman as an individual is a huge draw for WWE, I can't see myself ever voting for him. But in recent weeks, I've given some more consideration to what the Hall of Fame is and what it should represent. And so to some people, Roman is an obvious slam dunk candidate because of his kayfabe-based accomplishments. He's won many world titles. He has headlined WrestleMania many times. He is the most pushed star in WWE by a wide margin and has been for quite a long time now. But there was always this concept that he wasn't over enough to make a real difference at the box office. He wasn't over the way that John Cena was, or The Rock, or Hulk Hogan, or these other people that have been pushed to his level. And just in general, WWE's business has been in decline for so long. Can we really consider him a main event level attraction? But over time, I've thought about it more, and I go back and forth on just ultimately, Roman's going to end up being the biggest star in wrestling for a long period of time. If you just go by who is the most known active pro wrestler, he's going to end up headlining so many stadium shows. He might already have headlined the most stadium shows in wrestling history. I have no idea. I don't know the actual count, but it's got to be close because WWE's been running 4 or 5 stadium shows a year for the past 2 years. And at some point, it's going to become absurd that he's not in. And I don't have to like it, and I don't have to be the biggest champion of Roman Reigns and talk about what a massive star he is and just how he's different than everyone else. But it will become kind of absurd to just ignore this aspect that he's been this huge star and he's not going to be in the Observer Hall of Fame. What do you think about Roman Reigns as a candidate?
Yeah, I guess I'll talk about like my thoughts on the Hall of Fame in general, and then kind of contextualize that for Roman Reigns. I think one thing that is difficult for everybody to do is put, especially the Hall of Fame voters, it's no disrespect to any of them because this is difficult, but it's putting modern events and current events into proper historical context. And that's just something that's really difficult to do because you're always comparing what's happening now to your frame of reference, which is what's happened in the past. And so I liken what Roman Reigns, it's kind of like, if you think about like baseball and numbers over the years, especially like home runs, like, there's certain benchmarks that like, oh, if you get like 500 home runs, you're a Hall of Famer. But it's like different eras had more guys hitting more home runs. Like, Rafael Palmeiro hitting 50 home runs in the 90s when McGuire and Sosa and Griffey are hitting way more. It's not nearly as impressive as like, someone hitting 50, as like Babe Ruth hitting 50 home runs in an era where, the next closest guy was hitting like 12 or something like that. So I totally get the argument, and I've made this argument myself, that Roman, he doesn't influence business for WWE nearly as much as, like Hulk Hogan or Steve Austin or John Cena. But there's a lot of guys in the Hall of Fame who are not Stone Cold Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan or John Cena. And even if you look at John Cena's career, I'm working on a column right now doing like a year-over-year pay-per-view analysis for the entire pay-per-view era from like WrestleMania 2, until the network started in 2014, also including WCW and then AEW as well. And when I look at John Cena, it's like, yeah, he has a lot of pay-per-views that year over year, like increase double-digit percentages. So it's very clear, like, yeah, this guy is definitely a major draw. But then he also has like dozens of events that declined like double-digit percentages year to year as well. So even with like elite top guys, they're not successful all the time. Sometimes it takes them a little while, to become successful. So I think Roman eventually is just going to be like, he is the most famous guy from this era. And you're going to look at like, okay, well, if Roman's not going in from this era, like who is going in really, and the kind of the purpose of the Hall of Fame is to put in like, hey, who are the best, I guess, the best candidates from each era. And I know some eras might have more than others, but it just seems like at a certain point, he's just going to kind of have to go in because, you have to keep recognizing like, the biggest stars and the best wrestlers over time.
Yeah, that becomes a challenge for, I think, some people from a contemporary standpoint. I think for me, right, and this is a big thing with the Hall of Fame for me personally. And I think it is a issue. It is something with all voters, but how each voter is aware of it, I'm not really sure. But for me, confronting our individual tastes and biases and putting that into what should be an unbiased perspective, which Hall of Fame voting should be. Either somebody's career is worthy of being a Hall of Fame, is worthy of being elected into the Hall of Fame or not. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a huge fan of them. I loved their work. It should be, did they hit a certain criteria? And you should be able to look at it objectively without really reflecting that much on your own opinion. Now, the three criteria to get in the Hall of Fame are drawing power. People always say in-ring ability, but it's really excelling in wrestling in one field. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in-ring ability. If someone is an amazing promo or very charismatic and not a very good wrestler, they could still get in. I don't think there's too many candidates that are like that, that have got in solely based on promo ability or solely based on being very charismatic. But it's excelling, being actually good at the job. So it's drawing, being an objectively good performer, and historical significance. And drawing power is the most, cut and dry statistic-based one. We can look at drawing power in different eras. We can compare it for the most part from era to era. We can see how many tickets somebody sold in recent years. We can see how many pay-per-views they might have sold, what their television ratings might have been, impact on television ratings might have been. That's the most analytical and the one that's kind of the hardest to dispute. But then when you get into in-ring ability, I think you'll see like wide variations in how people view Roman Reigns. Some people will insist that he's amazing and he's great. Some people will insist that he's boring and not very good. You have to be kind of, that encourages your own opinion to be in it, which makes it even harder to kind of confront your own biases, which is like, I might think that Roman's not very good, but if everyone else seems to be like, Roman's great, then I do kind of have to consider that as part of my analysis, which is like, I know that I'm not going to be able to appreciate every single style of wrestling. And I'm not going to be able to appreciate every single wrestler who deserves appreciation because I'm limited in what my tastes allow me to really appreciate. And so you have to kind of confront that bias with the reality of what someone's actual performance is and how successful someone is to the broader audience, which is really what's important with the Hall of Fame, which is identifying the people who have had the biggest widespread impact on the industry. And that can be difficult when also I exist in this reality where I'm online every day and I'm talking about Roman Reigns with people and I'm fighting with people about Roman Reigns and fighting with the hardcore WWE fans and the people who don't watch wrestling outside of WWE who are going to tell me that Roman Reigns is the greatest wrestler of all time. It's hard to kind of live that and then also be like, step back and assess my own biases. I think Randy Orton is another candidate who falls into a similar bucket. Was Randy Orton one of your candidates?
He is not, but he kind of fits into this Roman Reigns discussion. One thing I'll point out I agree. I have the same problem. So what I like to do is look at like the Observer Awards each year to see like, and kind of look at those historically to say like, okay, maybe I don't really like somebody, but you know, if I can recognize that, okay, maybe I'm in the minority if, you know, they're getting a lot of support. And with Roman, honestly, like he didn't really have any. I think the only time he placed top 5 in the Observer Awards before last year was like when he was, I think he won Best Tag Team with Seth Rollins, like the 2013. Outside of that, he didn't place top 5 like ever in anything. But I think last year he was like in the top 5 for Wrestler of the Year. And that actually aligned with my perception of him as well, was that, yeah, WWE was pushing him a lot, but he was getting the Cena reaction without the Cena box office, which isn't the best combination for the majority of his run. But last year, or you know, when this whole tribal chief gimmick started, which I agree is a little repetitive and stale, but it's when the first time I was really like, oh, I'm actually kind of impressed with, you know, what he's doing performance wise. He feels like, you know, the top star they always wanted him to be, and you know, even the Observer voters are, you know, recognizing that and you know, by voting him highly in the Wrestler of the Year award.
Yeah, it's one of those things like with Orton, you know, the reason I brought up Orton, because Orton was this perfect example of this guy who won a lot of championships and headlined a bunch of shows, and people would kind of insist he's like the perfect professional wrestler because he's got a great look and he's very smooth in the ring and he rarely makes mistakes. But to hardcore fans like ourselves, there was this thinking that Orton was boring, that he was this technically fine wrestler who never actually had exciting matches, that he was this guy who had become very stale on top and all of these things. And you kind of lived in this world where you're constantly pushing back against Randy Orton. And then the Hall of Fame season comes around and you're like, no way is or Randy Orton a Hall of Famer. Like he's, you know, boring and he's been overrated. And that's a kind of natural disposition, is to be very antagonistic towards Randy Orton praise. But at the same time, you have to look at things rationally and say like, man, if a lot of people think he's really good, then that has to be considered. And you can't ignore that he did succeed as a top star in WWE, whether or not he, you know, is individually a huge draw. Maybe that's not the case, but he definitely has succeeded in that realm. And I think it's one of those things I think is challenging to kind of assess yourself. And that's why I think Reigns is a really interesting candidate, because I am wrestling media's foremost Roman Reigns hater. I am the biggest Roman Reigns disrespecter, I feel like, on the rational side of wrestling media. But even I am looking at his Hall of Fame case and having to assess his career in his totality. And I will not be voting for him this year, but I shouldn't be as dismissive about it as I think I once was, if we're going to really assess this. And I think, I don't know if it's you who posted in the VOW Discord about this, but I think there was a breakdown of like candidates who were in the Hall of Fame by decade of when they were main eventers or whatever. And it was candidates that are in the Hall of Fame based on the decade they turned 35, which is the year they would become eligible. Yeah, in the theoretical prime, right, which would be when they're 35. That's not the prime for every wrestler, but just for as a general baseline. And the 2000s and the 2010s are very underrepresented in the Hall of Fame. And I think part of that is because with a wrestler like Roman Reigns, in any contemporary talent, really, the standards for drawing are very different than what they were for every other era, where you could easily look at attendance, you could see at things fluctuated more often than they do now. It was easier to pop a house or get on a hot run, just the way you could attract fans, the way you could attract casual fans who maybe wouldn't normally watch, was so different in earlier eras. Wrestling was more ubiquitous in society in general. It's hard to compare like drawing statistics today with drawing statistics from the previous 100 years of pro wrestling. And so you can look at a candidate like Roman Reigns, or you can look at a candidate like Kenny Omega, who got in already, or Bryan Danielson, or whoever, and you can say, well, it's harder to parse out their individual drawing power the way it's easy to parse out like someone like Terry Funk or someone like, who's a good territory, like Abdullah the Butcher.
Hmm.
We can say like, oh, Abdullah the Butcher, he came to the Dallas territory and he drew this house and that house or in this house, and look how big of a star he was. And then he went to Puerto Rico and he drew here, like, and you could just track someone's direct impact on business much easier in like the territory era, or even in like the 90s where talent flip-flop between promotions back and forth all the time, than it is today, where talent is largely the same. Roster turnover is very minimal compared to previous generations. And it's harder to see who's drawing this year and who's drawing that year. And it becomes, even the drawing, which is supposed to be the least arbitrary figure and the clearest cut fact-based argument when it comes to the Hall of Fame criteria, even that has become debatable now in our world today. So it becomes very difficult to analyze some of these guys. And like you said,
Oh yeah.
using the same standard, like you can't use the same drawing standard that we used in the territory era. And I think some people do, and it's hard to put a uniform measure on that.
Yeah, it's weird because it's like you had mentioned in talking, you're like, oh, when WWE's business was going down, it's like, well, actually, during the Roman Reigns era, it's like, well, actually, their business is better than it's ever been
Right.
before. Their consumer metrics have gone down, which is just a weird thing to think about. It's like less people are interested than like even some WWE draws less houses than like lower houses than like some territories were drawing during their hottest peaks regularly. But like the amount of money that WWE has is just ridiculous compared to like any promotion that ever existed.
No wrestling promotion has made more money than WWE has with Roman Reigns on top. That's a fact.
Yeah, that is.
And how do you attribute that to Roman Reigns? Is it because he's such a big star on television that their TV deals are so valuable? That's unlikely. He doesn't move ratings to that level, but you could argue that Reigns has been steady enough on television to give WWE television the consistency week to week in the ratings that has made it such a secure investment for these big cable companies to shell out billion-dollar television deals. I think
strange. One thing that's interesting with Roman, at least, one thing that I like to look at when judging, like, okay, like when people talk about star power, like how relevant are these people really, is to look at their Google trends and compare them to like other people from their contemporaries from the same era. And I'll just say that Roman does really well in that respect. If you look at it from, even if it's just the US, because, obviously WWE stars are going to be, have much more worldwide searches and interest just because they're more international than other wrestling companies. But even if you just look at it from the US perspective, Roman does really well compared to all his contemporaries. So I think there's more to his, like, I understand not liking him and questioning like how much he really is a draw, but I think some of it's just, okay, given like the network era that exists, I mean, the only guys in from the network era, it's really like Brock Lesnar, who kind of spans both. He goes into the pay-per-view era as well. Bryan Danielson, and that's about it, really. Like John Cena got in, I think, before they even started the network stuff. I guess AJ Styles is one too. So there's only really a couple guys in from that era, and so eventually it's just like you got to recognize. It feels like you have to recognize someone, and compared to his contemporaries, it doesn't, like, Roman seems like the obvious choice.
Yeah, and I think I've said this before, like the Hall of Fame is going to have to reckon with the concept that we can't use the same kind of standards for the old guys that we use for talent that's been wrestling in the 2010s and beyond, because we're going to end up with candidates who none of the candidates are going to pass the test, if in that sense. And if Roman doesn't pass the test, who does?
Yeah, and bringing up the money thing, that was just one way you can say, like, oh, well, these guys were draws because they impacted business more. It's like, okay, but in the case, even if Roman's been like a quote unquote draw in terms of getting additional interest into shows fewer times, when he's done that, if you credit him with like the revenue WWE was drawing like for those months or whatever, it's far bigger than what like someone from the territories would have been drawn. So, and that's, that's why comparing eras and stuff just gets difficult. You can make arguments both ways.
Yeah, and you get things like, okay, well, Roman Reigns, he drew, if you credit him with like a WrestleMania gate, which is like this gigantic gate figure, it's like it's gonna be $10 million or whatever. Obviously, if it was a older wrestler that drew a big gate, you'd give full credit to the older wrestler for having this big show. We're going to give credit to Buddy Rogers and Pat O'Connor for drawing the Comiskey Field match in 1961. But with Reigns, where WrestleMania sells 50,000 tickets before a single match has been announced, can we really credit the talent that much for selling tickets for that big gate? You can't use the same standard. It's a very it's something that I think voters have to reckon with.
I will say, if you're someone who's buying a ticket for WrestleMania like a couple months in advance, you're probably pretty sure Roman Reigns is going to be in.
But if Roman Reigns isn't on the show, are people really going to be that disappointed, or does he have to be? Like, he wasn't on night 2 of WrestleMania, and that show drew bigger than night 1, or he wasn't on night 1 of WrestleMania this year, and that one drew bigger than night 2. So, it's very
well. Stone Cold Steve Austin.
I know Steve Austin was on. I know Steve Austin was on night 1, but the point is that it's hard to give an individual credit for those kind of gates the way you used to be able to like credit Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant for WrestleMania 3.
For sure.
So
for sure.
That's it on Reigns. What candidate are you thinking about?
So the first one I wanted to talk about was Tetsuya Naito, because as Joe Lanza likes to say, what are we doing here? I don't really understand the argument against him or why he's not one of the top 5 candidates in Japan. Like, if you want to say the Holy Demon Army is better, then okay, sure. But outside of that, I don't really see how you could not have him as one of your top 5 candidates. And I don't know if it's just a Western perception or because like Okada had the belt for so long, but like Tetsuya Naito was the most popular act in Japan during New Japan's like peak over the past, the pre-pandemic, 5 years or so there, where they were, really growing and really peaked with their, their attendance, and business was really hot. He was their #1 merch sales guy. I hate to just use this anecdotally, but I went to the Tokyo Dome show in 2018 for Naito versus Okada and Omega versus Jericho, and the LIJ merch there was like 10 LIJ shirts to every one for someone else, like combined. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, Naito was definitely, everyone came there to see Naito win, and then he didn't, which was a surprise. But yeah, he's been their top star, or he was one of their top stars, and definitely arguably their most popular star during that golden age. And also, he's a hell of a wrestler too. He's not bad. Like, he's having like match of the year quality matches, placing highly in the Observer Awards, like most charismatic. And I've heard some people say like, oh, that's because he's working with Okada and Tanahashi and Kenny Omega. Naito had a 5-star match with Michael Elgin for the Intercontinental title. That's Dave's rating, but I also thought that was a 5-star match. So it's not like he was just some guy who was pretty good that was getting carried by people better than him. He was a great wrestler in his own right, and definitely a great draw. And, as we were saying earlier, even in Japan, like, I think there's only 3 guys who turned 35 in the 2010s who are in, and then Okada, who turned 35 in the 2020s. So yeah, it just seems like that this modern era is underrepresented, but it was a lot more successful than New Japan in the 2000s. Like, if you're comparing Naito to, say, and I know it's different, the circumstances they were under, but like, if you're comparing Naito to Yuji Nagata or Jun Akiyama, and you could say like Yuji Nagata and Akiyama are much better wrestlers, and that's fine, like, if you want to say that, but Naito's not that far behind them in terms of, how great he is as a wrestler. But if you look at like what their impact was on business and what happened to the promotions when they were the top guys, or, one of the top stars, both of them were on top while promotions were declining, whereas Naito, helped New Japan reach heights that it hadn't seen since the 90s.
It's interesting. So there are voters from Japan. There are Japanese voters in the Hall of Fame. I don't know what the makeup is when it comes to voting in the Japanese category. How many are Western fans and how many are Japanese-based fans or wrestlers or things like that. And that's you raise a really key point here, which is that I think the perception in the West is that Naito is kind of like the third or fourth most popular person in New Japan. And there have been years in Japan where Naito was easily the number one most popular wrestler, ahead of Tanahashi, ahead of Okada, ahead of Shinsuke Nakamura, Bullet Club, whoever else you want to pick. And so with the thing with Naito is Japan, the Japan category is, I think, by far the strongest category when it comes to candidates. You have 5 votes. I might use all 5, which I rarely do, because I don't know who to pick out of this group. But Naito is my number 1 in that group for sure. But I just think the depth of viable candidates in Japan right now is really high. And I think sometimes Naito falls through the cracks, and he's not able to pick up the kind of unanimous support that's necessary, because you need to get at least 60% of the vote to get in. You need to be on at least 60% of the ballots to get in. And I think the Japan category, the way it's broken down the last few years and the way it looks this year, especially with the implementation of tag teams, is it's going to be hard for him to get that support again. Because I think what happens is, I think there's a lot of people in Japan that like get votes for being like personal favorites of wrestlers. I think just the way the Japanese the categories break down, you'll have the people that really, really like Hayabusa and want to vote for him. There are people that really like Shima and want to vote for him. There are people like Yoshiaki Fujiwara and want to vote for him. Ishii has gained a lot of momentum. They're just these guys, and I'm not saying not dismissing any of those guys' candidacy out of hand, but I just think there are a lot of guys who I think are clearly weaker candidates than Naito, but they kind of get added to ballots because guys you need to have at least 15% to stay on the ballot each year. So people want to keep them on the ballot and just kind of strategically vote like that. And I think it's harder. Naito is not Okada, who's coming in and getting 90+% of the vote and kind of getting on like that. And I think if you look at him, I agree with everything you said about him as a draw. I think he's really underrated as a worker, and underrated in a weird way, where it's like, it's not like people are like, oh, Naito's not that good, or Naito it doesn't know how to work, or Naito's not a Hall of Fame level worker. It's more like people just be like, yeah, Naito's a really good wrestler, he's a really good worker, he's had a ton of great matches, but like they're really like dismissive of like that meaning anything for Naito in a way that like they're not for Ishii. I'm fascinated that Ishii has gotten kind of this grassroots support creeping up for him solely based on work rate, where in my opinion Naito is better than Ishii as a worker, and he blows them away when it comes to drawing power and being a big star and all of these things like that. Like and so it's hard for me to kind of view it like that. But I think Japan just being such a logjam, it's only going to be worse this year with the Holy Demon Army on, and Inoki and Saguchi and Toyota and Yamada, and like, so these tag teams getting thrown on there, it's going to just add even more tension to this what has already been a logjam.
Yeah, I also think Naito gets penalized because he had his big reign that was supposed to come, and the shows after that Tokyo Dome in 2020, like before the pandemic hit, were selling really well, and then pandemic hits, his whole reign is just they didn't even have shows for a while, and then when they did, it's limited attendance, you can't make any noise. They gave Evil the title for a little bit.
Yeah, New Japan's booking was not as strong once he got his title reign.
No,
it had been before.
And I mean, you can understand some of that, but I don't understand giving Evil the title ever. But yeah, so like that, his reign itself kind of fell flat a bit through no fault of his own. And that kind of would have been like, kind of the crown jewel, that tops off his career and makes him kind of undeniable. And it didn't really happen. But at the same, just looking at like what he did accomplish even before that, it just seems like that should definitely be more than enough, especially when you're comparing it to other people who are already in the Hall of Fame for Japan.
Yeah, like if you were to compare him to Nakamura, I think he blows away Nakamura as a candidate. I think, and I think, you know what, he didn't get exactly where they wanted him to be under this spell, but before he went to Mexico, before he started Los Ingobernables de Japan, when he was Stardust Genius Naito, I don't think that guy was really good. Like, he was an incredible worker, and he was over to a degree. He wasn't as over as they wanted to. There was the time he won the G1, and then they voted him to not main event the G1, the Wrestle Kingdom, because they wanted to vote for Tanahashi and Nakamura. And so there are some signs that he wasn't as over as he probably should. They wanted him to be, but that guy was like, that's part of his career, and I think that also gets dismissed
for sure
by him. Like, I think I was talking about this with someone else last year, but I was like, so Nakamura, who also got he gets pushed as a rookie, as like the greatest rookie of all time, and he wins the title within like a year of his debut, and it just didn't work, and New Japan's business wasn't doing very well. And I think Hall of Fame time, like, Nakamura got credit for that. Like, Nakamura, he was, youngest IWGP champion in history, and he was this, super rookie, and, he's been a headliner for 10 years. And Nakamura got credit for that. And I feel like Naito's, pre Los Ingobernables career is kind of dismissed and not part of his legacy. But if you go back and watch like those matches, like, he's having these incredible matches that deserve, that are all part of his resume, all part of things that deserve consideration.
Yeah, I mean, he had a great match with AJ Styles at the Tokyo Dome 1 year, and I agree. He was very, even though he wasn't like I don't think you can argue him like as a draw during that period, because when they did push him, it didn't work very well. But he was doing really good work. It's not like he was Yoshihashi out there before he was an LIJ.
Yeah, I mean, he was a main event guy. He wasn't as solidified as a main event guy, but he was a guy that main evented many shows. It wasn't like he was a mid carder. He was probably like the fourth or fifth biggest star in the company. So I'll move on. I'll make this one briefer because a lot of it, the argument is similar in reigns. But the next guy I had was Edge. And I want to talk about something.
Okay.
I want to talk about something very specific with Edge.
Okay.
And it has to do with Edge's in-ring work and in-ring ability, because I think he has some positive things as a draw. He's not going to get in based on drawing. He's not John Cena. He's not even probably Roman Reigns, but he main evented shows. He headlined WrestleMania before. He's done stuff to warrant at least some consideration as a draw, but he's really going to have to get in because people think he has excelled as a performer throughout his career. And the big thing with Edge is, if I told you, we'll do this exercise right now. If I told you, Adam, Edge is a great wrestler and he's had many, many great matches, how would you respond to that?
Yes, I agree.
So you agree. Cynic would say, but how many great regular singles matches has he had?
I'll say this, more than you'd think.
Right.
I know where you're going, but a lot more than you'd think.
So Edge, if you think about the most memorable Edge matches and the great Edge matches, almost all of them are going to be some variation of no disqualification matches. There might be the TLC matches. There might be some Hell in a Cell matches. There might be the street fight with Mick Foley at WrestleMania 22. There are all of these style of matches that are kind of plunder matches, that are gimmick matches. And I think there are people who are dismissive of that style of wrestling, kind of meaning like that doesn't really mean that you're great. Like, it doesn't like to be a great wrestler, you have to be Bret Hart, or you have to be Luthez, if you want to go back further, but just like you have to be someone who can just go in there, Bryan Danielson, and have a great wrestling match without any gimmicks. And I understand that, like, from a skill department, it is more impressive when people have great matches that don't involve gimmicks. But at the same time, should that really matter? He either has great matches or he doesn't. Like, do we really care that if you argue, well, Edge wasn't talented enough to have great singles, no DQ match, great singles standard matches. He needed those gimmicks to have great matches. You could logically just say, like, does it matter? He had great matches. That's all that matters. Was he great in those matches? Yes, he was. Was he a great performer in those matches? Yes, he was. It shouldn't matter that he didn't have many single, 25-minute, back and forth Ricky Steamboat style matches. And I find that I've been debating about that back and forth, because when I first got my first year, I voted for Edge, because I just thought he was a great wrestler. And then the next year, I was like, I don't want to vote for Edge. I think I was being biased. I think as a child, I liked Edge, and I kind of translated him being a greater performer than I think he really is. And I became more cynical about his match style and things like that. But now I think about it again, and I'm thinking, like, does it really matter that he used a lot of chairs and he fell off some ladders and things like that? Like, those are still extremely memorable moments. They were exciting moments in wrestling history. There are many people who got into wrestling during the Attitude Era as children and saw Edge spearing Jeff Hardy off the ladder and said, man, wrestling's the absolute best. And so I think it becomes kind of difficult for me I'm conflicted on how to assess that, because I also am sympathetic to the idea that he just had all these gimmicks, and in that he isn't like other wrestlers can have good matches in those settings in a way that, like, Hiroshi, he's not unique in the way that, like, Hiroshi Tanahashi might be uniquely brilliant in how he performs. So, like, if he's going to get in as a mostly a work rate based candidate, how does that play a factor into how we should assess his career?
Sure. Yeah, one thing I would say about Edge is that I think he's underrated, like how good he was in regular matches. I'll say that he could be kind of high variance, because there were plenty of times where he was just kind of dull.
Like now,
for sure. Yeah, like now. But also he's kind of old now, and he's had a lot of injuries. And I'll just say this: for his age and the injuries that he's had, he should be way worse, than he is. I think he could be way better. I think it's more just the, like, modern WWE, and it's just so over the top, and he kind of it helps him give in to, like, his worst instincts instead of tightening things up. But if you look at, like, the Observer Awards, and I think Fred Moreland does his Observer Award share, columns and metrics, Edge actually does surprisingly well. If you look at 2002 specifically, before his neck injury, I mean, Edge was killing it that year with matches with Angle, the tags with Ray against Benoit and Angle, and Eddie and Chavo. He also had, like, this crazy no DQ match with Eddie, which that was a no DQ match, like you said, but it was really, really good. So, like, Edge that year was just like a phenomenal in-ring talent, gimmicks or no gimmicks. He just had a hell of a year. And that was, before his neck surgery. And then when he came back, he was never quite, I felt he was never quite the same, but he still had a lot of really good matches. I mean, before The Undertaker was, had his matches with Shawn Michaels, you could make a very strong case that the singles match he had with Edge at Mania was The Undertaker's best WrestleMania match. Mick Foley had that awesome Mania match with Edge. So he has a lot of memorable matches, for sure. And in terms of, like, the ladder matches being shortcuts, I mean, there's been a lot of bad ladder matches. And I know it's, like, there's a lot of ladder matches that are just, like, kind of good, but, like, Edge had a legitimately great ladder match with, like, a late 50s or around 60-year-old Ric Flair in 2006. Like, how many people could just think about how many people could do that? Have a great ladder match with old, broken down Ric Flair. Like, that takes skill for sure. Like, there's a skill to doing ladder matches well, and Edge was, I can't, obviously he was in so many, I can't remember all of them, but I don't ever remember, like, watching an Edge ladder match or gimmick match and being like, yeah, that was bad. Like, all of that, other than whatever that last man standing awful thing was with Randy Orton.
I was going to say the WrestleMania match.
Yeah, I'll say, okay, the pre-retirement, I don't remember like any sort of Edge gimmick match and coming away from it and being like, oh, that was bad. You know, he always delivered to some degree when he was put in those big spots. I will say though that from a drawing perspective, I'm finishing up a column right now on year-over-year pay-per-view analysis, and looking at like the headliners, or you know, it's different. Like sometimes I'll look at like everyone who was in the top 2 matches. Sometimes it's just one match. It kind of depends on the event. But Edge, I think in terms of like influencing like double-digit growth from the prior year, so you have at least 10% more buy rates from the same event the prior year. Of all the pay-per-views Edge headline, which I think is like in the 30s, he only had 2 that were up over 10%. So but he did have a lot where it stayed about the same, like, you know, within 10% in either direction. So he was kind of like a steward, like he was a guy they could put in the main event and keep things about the same, but he wasn't going to like he wasn't going to like grow the promotion, but you know, he was solid.
He never like caught fire and was like
no
the big deal. And that's why my point is kind of like, he has to be a work rate candidate. He has some, he's not like a he's not like Ishii is as a candidate, where it's like you either think he's a great in-ring guy and he deserves to be an in-ring, or he's not. Like Edge he's main evented enough shows and drawn enough money collectively to do that, to at least say that he was also a main eventer and he, you know, won titles and things like that. I think the last thing I'll say about is like, he's also part of his career is like just being a victim of circumstance in how WWE booked and how WWE presents main event pay-per-view matches. They're mostly gimmick matches now. Roman Reigns mostly has gimmick matches in his, you know, this tribal chief run. It's a lot of last man standing matches or street fights and no disqualification matches, Hell in a Cell, whatever. That's just how WWE does its product, is they do a lot of gimmick matches on pay-per-view. So in a lot of ways, Edge was not, you know, he wasn't in a world where he's working the G1, because if he was, he'd probably have a lot more high quality singles matches. Like, but he wasn't. He was in WWE in the 2000s and 2010s, and what they did was a lot of ladder matches and a lot of TLC matches and a lot of cage and Hell in a Cell matches. That's what the environment he was in. So it's not necessarily his fault for succeeding a lot as a performer in that environment.
Yeah, I've said it before, but I think with Edge, you could make a case for each criteria, that he meets each criteria as a Hall of Famer, but none of them are overwhelming. So it's kind of it's interesting. I've also said that he's either going to be like one of the weakest candidates in the Hall of Fame or one of the strongest candidates not in the Hall of Fame.
Well, that's good.
So he's kind of like,
but that's good. That's how it should be. Who's your second guy on the list?
So my second act I want to talk about is one that I find very intriguing for a number of reasons, and that's the Von Erichs, Terry, Kevin, and David. And some of it is just kind of how do you interpret those three together, because, and the reason I say this is because the Freebirds are in the Hall of Fame as a trio. So they all got credit, even when they weren't like necessarily all in the same match together. It's not like you only looked at the Freebirds when they were doing 6-man tags. Same thing with the Midnight Express. You know, it's not like they only got credit when they got 6-man tags. It was when 2 of the 3 of them were working together. So if you go by that same principle and you apply it to the Von Erichs, like the time they were working like 6-man tags together is relatively narrow, obviously, because David dies in, I think, 84. So their promotion was really hot then. You know, they're working against like Gary Hart, you know, in his stable, the Freebirds. So that period in itself is really hot. But if you just look at it as, okay, when were 2 of the 3 of them tagging together, then you get basically all of World Class's rise and fall, because Kevin and David are tagging together regularly in the late 70s. Like they're going to All Japan in like, you know, 78, I think. So they're tagging together in like 78, 79. And then Kerry and Kevin are tagging together regularly, like throughout the 80s, I think like into 88 at least on a regular basis. So, and those three, like, it's not even just those three, like as a group, like, you know, in different pairs, they're the primary baby faces for world class. Like the heels are coming in and out. They're the guys who are there, you know, month in and month out, drawing. So, and it's kind of like, okay, it's the family together, you know, facing whatever big bad invaders are coming in to beat up, you know, the pretty boys that all the local girls love. And so I think if you look at it that way, I don't see how you can't vote for them. Also, I'm not even sure if they're in the modern or the historical. I don't know which one they're supposed to be in. I think there's some confusion on that. But whatever the case, whichever one they're in, if you're looking at it that way, I don't see how you could not vote for them.
Yeah, and so it was very strange how Dave did this thing this year where he put tag teams on the ballot. He put more tag teams on the ballot, and the big thing was that tag teams that had one member in previously and not another member, like Holy Demon Army, right? Toshiaki Kawada was in already, Akira Taue was not. So they never appeared on the ballot, even though most people would argue that they're one of the greatest tag teams of all time. And so Dave made a big push to put tag teams on the ballot. But he also said that you should only consider their tag team work, and you shouldn't consider any singles matches or things like that. And it becomes hard to draw that line, just like you said, with the Von Erichs in particular. And what's interesting with the Von Erichs is they're just on the ballot this year as a unit. Like none of the Von Erichs are in the Hall of Fame, because I don't think we're supposed to be considering Fritz Von Erich who's in. But as far as the Von Erich brothers, none of those guys are in. So they're fresh kind of names on the ballot this year. And it's like, if you use the principle, it's like, okay, are we just going by the 6-man tags they had? That's a very limited number of matches we should consider. Could things like what most people would consider like the biggest achievement of the Von Erichs careers, which is the first Parade of Champions at Texas Stadium, the Kerry Von Erich versus Ric Flair match, like, okay, Kerry gets that match because David Von Erich, who was supposed to get it, dies a few months before. So it's this big emotional thing where, you know, Kerry is wrestling it for his brother. Like that to me should count as the overall legacy of the Von Erichs. And that huge gate that they did, the 32,000 people, should be considered part of the Von Erichs case. But you could argue that since it's a singles match, it's kind of post their career, those guys really that shouldn't really be considered part of the legacy. Of course, also on that show, Kevin, Mike, and Fritz Von Erich had a match against the Fabulous Freebirds, so they're also part of that. They're also part of that show. So, like, do we credit, if we're looking at the biggest event of world class history, which is that show? What should we look at? Are we counting it as a gate drawn by the Von Erich boys, or are we looking at it as something that kind of was past the real peak of the Von Erichs as a unit?
It's
a hard distinction to make. And you can look at other tag teams and look in the same way. Like, do you consider, like, if a tag team has a very successful breakup angle, does the houses that they draw during that breakup angle, does that count as their overall legacy as a tag team? Functionally, it feels like it should, because it shows this tag team was important. It meant a lot to fans when they broke up. But at the same time, you could say, well, they're not a tag team anymore, so it shouldn't count. And I think the rules are very unclear. I'm not happy with the tag team rules. I think they're strange this year. And the Von Erichs, I think, are really, they're certainly very famous candidates. There aren't really any other candidates on this ballot that I would consider as famous as the Von Erichs, especially now, because I think their life story has been so fascinating from a documentary perspective that people who aren't fans of wrestling can listen to that story and find it, you know, fascinating and intriguing. But to me, my case against the Von Erichs to me is that they didn't draw for a long enough period of time as top guys. So
I would look at, if you just look at how world class grew and on their backs, like world class just explode, like it gets so popular, that promotion gets so popular. They're the combination of them are the top baby faces for that.
That's a good point.
It's
not like we're looking at a promotion that was this gigantic territory before they really took off.
No. No, and like it got like I mean, it's been a little bit since I've seen one of the documentaries, but I remember just being floored by like the ratings they were doing
Mhm.
and like really how popular it got. And obviously, you know, that did fall off and it crashed, but like, and when you're considering like Hall of Fame level draws and you look at how much that promotion grew, like they got so hot they left the NWA because they were like, we don't need you anymore. Like we're killing it. Like, and that's the thing. Those guys were so. If you just look at where the promotion was and then where it went, and they're the top baby faces the whole time. There's nobody else where you're like, oh yeah, no, it's you got to credit that to someone else. Obviously, their opponents, you know, deserve credit to some degree, but they're the constant, like while that growth is happening. So, in looking at it that way, it just seems like, yeah, this is definitely something that needs to be recognized in the Hall of Fame for sure.
So my next candidate, we've already touched on them a bit, but I'm going to go with Holy Demon Army. And I'm bringing them up because I don't like that they're on the ballot. I don't like this tag team rule that Dave has instituted. I think it is a conspiracy to get Akira Taue in the Hall of Fame. Not really, but I think it's, to me, it comes back to the loaded Japanese group. So with the Holy Demon Army, we are supposed to only consider their work as a tag team, which is very successful, amazing matches, drew very well, checks the boxes you want to see in a Hall of Fame act, right? Holy Demon Army definitely drew, but it becomes complicated because Toshiaki Kawada is already in the Hall of Fame. And I recognized, I think Kawada was voted in. He was not in a part of the inaugural class because I don't think his career lines up nicely for him to have been voted in 96, but I think he gets voted in like 97. If I was a voter during that time period, which I wouldn't have been because I was 3 years old, I would have voted for Kawada because he checks all those boxes. But what this really is just a referendum on Taue, because the difference is, when tag teams are on the ballot, you're supposed to consider their work as a tag team and nothing else. You're not supposed to consider Taue's solo career and Kawada's solo career. And when you're a singles act, you can consider everything. You can consider how they drew as a single star, but also how they drew as a tag team. So in a huge piece of the Taue argument for when Taue was on the ballot as a singles wrestler was his success in Holy Demon Army and all these great matches he had with Kawada and against Misawa and Kobashi and everyone else. And to me, as a person who did not vote for Taue, and a majority of people have not voted for Taue, it's why he didn't get in as a singles act, that wasn't enough for me to vote Taue in. I didn't feel like his career expanded far enough outside of the Holy Demon Army. And he didn't have the kind of variety of success and as an individual draw and as an in-ring guy outside of working with Kawada, Misawa, and Kobashi. It's a classic example of someone who happened to be wrestling a lot of great opponents. And I'm not like totally like Taue can never get in. It would be a crime if he got in. I totally see people who love Taue and want to vote him in. But when it comes to voting in the Holy Demon Army, it's like, well, if I didn't think Taue's success in his career as the whole Taue case when he was on the ballot as a singles wrestler, which includes his tag team work, that didn't pass the bar for me. Why do I want to vote him in now? Just because now his career is being directly linked to Kawada again. And it's like, I think those matches are great because Kawada is great. And I think they drew because Kawada was on the team. I think another, like Raka and Perez is another one, because Dave will tell you, Raka and Perez have to be in. They're the greatest drawing tag team of all time when you look at some attendance measures, and they were selling out Madison Square Garden all the time in the 50s. And it's like, yeah, because Argentina Raka is like one of the 5 biggest drawing cards in the history of wrestling, and he was he was on that team. Like, that doesn't mean that Miguel Perez is now a Hall of Famer because he happened to be in the ring with Raka, who is the main star. And I feel like the gap is not as big between Taue and Kawada as it is with Raka and Perez, but it's the same principle in that I feel like I'm being asked, like, I didn't think Taue's career was good enough to get him in the Hall of Fame as an individual. Now I'm looking at really a reduced case for Taue, which is only his tag work now. And now I'm supposed to believe that his case is stronger and I got to vote for him now to get him in. I don't like that. I don't like that because I think it's basically tying Taue directly to Kawada in a way that didn't exist when they were just singles wrestlers and you could kind of parse out their careers. It's something like, how can you not vote for Holy Demon Army, right? How that's they should take away your ballot if you don't vote for HDA. But when I think about it as just kind of like, this is just a referendum on getting Taue in, because no one cared that HDA wasn't in Kawada, because it meant Kawada wasn't in, because Kawada was already in. It's solely only on there to get Taue in a lot of ways. And I don't agree with the kind of argument. I might be using crazy logic to some people, but that's just how I feel about it.
I can follow your logic. I think where I feel differently about this, and the reason I do is because when someone goes in as a single on the ballot, you're looking at their entire career and saying, okay, like, did this person as an individual have a is this individual like worthy of the Hall of Fame? And so when you see an individual Hall of Famer, you think about not just the stuff they did in tag teams, but also the stuff they did as an individual. And so when you look at Taue, it's like, yeah, the Holy Demon Army is without a doubt the best part of his career, both from an in-ring perspective and from a drawing perspective. But if he was to get in on his own, you know, I think like the rest of his career kind of detracts actually from the strength of the Holy Demon Army a bit, because, you know, he has some great matches, but they're not as great as the ones with the Holy Demon Army, at least not as many, for sure. He has the drawing as well. You know.
Yeah, he has to run with, like, before Saruta gets sick, he has where he's with Saruta and Masafuchi, and they're taking on Kobashi, Kawada, and Misawa as a trio, which were like kind of watershed 6-man tags at the time. But that's my point, is kind of like, we're changing the standard for how Taue should get in a lot of ways.
You're looking at it as like how Taue, I would just look at it as, I look at them as different acts. Like I look at like Akira Taue as an act. Was Akira Taue like a Hall of Fame act? And it's like, I'm not sure, you know, and I think that's kind of what the ballot results, I'm sure. Like, I'm not sure if Akira Taue was a Hall of Fame act. Akira Taue and Toshiaki Kawada together, that's definitely a Hall of Fame act. Like, their matches were incredible. They drew really well. Like, when these two guys were together, definitely a Hall of Fame act. But here's the thing, like, you can, like, when you can look, I think because they both also had significant singles careers, you look at it as them being kind of separate instead of just looking like at the act as a unit and the time they were together. Right. Like, if you look at, let me put it to you this way, like, is Road Warrior Hawk a Hall of Famer? Like, if you were just voting on Road Warrior Hawk individually, like, no, you're not. You're thinking about like his time with Draws and falling off the Titantron, and you know, his weird like feuds in WCW while Animal was hurt by himself, when he was by himself. And it's like, no, he definitely wasn't a Hall of Fame guy on his own. He didn't have a Hall of Fame career on his own. But if you just limit it to the Road Warriors being together, it's like, yeah, undoubtedly, like those guys were amazing together and drew a ton of money together. So that's the way I kind of look at it. It's just, you're just kind of looking at, okay, when these guys were together, how strong were they? Like, do they meet the Hall of Fame criteria when they were together? And in that case, you know, I think Holy Demon Army, like, you have to say yes.
But with Road Warrior Hawk, like, I would say he's a Hall of Famer because you're factoring in all of his tag team work. You're not dismissing just his singles wrestling career. You're factoring in his work as a member of the Road Warriors. So I would say, yeah, Road Warrior Hawk and Road Warrior Animal, they're both Hall of Famers. I think part of this is the challenge is someone being paired up in a tag team with a wrestler who is has a much better case to get in and is a much bigger star and was, in my opinion, a much better worker. And so it kind of lifts them up a little bit. It's like, I'm sure if you were to look at like the drawing record of like Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake in like the 80s, it would probably be pretty good. You would say they probably drew a lot more money than a lot of tag teams that are in the Hall of Fame consideration. But okay, why did they do that? Okay, because Hulk Hogan was a huge star, and Hulk Hogan could have been tag teaming with me, and he would still draw a lot of money. And so that kind of makes it. Now, obviously, the gap is not as big with Taue and Kawada, but at the same time, it seems crazy to not vote for the Holy Demon Army. But I'm using this logic in a lot of ways to justify not voting for them because I want to vote for other candidates in Japan. And I resent this tag team nonsense. Inoki and Saguchi is very similar in the sense that, they probably drew really well as a tag team, but Antonio Inoki was on the team, man. Like, it's like saying that, like,
yeah. I think that's part of the analysis, though, is you have to look at it and say, all right, is the whole of the team bigger than the sum of its parts? Yeah. Because, like, I agree. Like, if it's just a situation where it's one guy who's already in because he was a major star, and yeah, the tag team was really successful, but the other person is just kind of tagging along, it doesn't really add anything, then yeah, like, the bigger star that's already in the Hall of Fame, like, they're already kind of represented in there, and what the other person was adding to the team, that was this Hall of Fame act potentially, they weren't really adding much. So it's more just like a chapter in the bigger star's career. But with Kawada and Taue, I think Taue was adding a lot to that team just because, like, those matches are so great, and those matches are not nearly as great if, like, Kawada is tagging with a giant Baba, as an example.
Okay, well, Taue's better than late 90s giant Baba.
Well, also, I just want to say, if you're saying that you would vote for, this might actually change your mind, just because if you would vote for tag team members individually into the Hall of Fame, then you're supporting Michael Hayes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not okay with that. So I like the tag team rule because I'm not voting for Michael Hayes.
And part of this is, at least I'm a strong believer in that the tag team, like, if a tag team is going to make the Hall of Fame, we see this with women wrestlers as well. If a tag team or a women's wrestler is going to make the Hall of Fame, they should be, for the most part, assessed on a scale of how they're related to singles. They should be on the same scale as male singles acts, right? If someone, just because a team was the best tag team for a while, if they weren't drawing money comparable to top acts on the singles side, they really shouldn't be considered. It's like teams like the Road Warriors or the Midnight Express can get in because you look at them and those were main event acts, and they drew big, and they had, or in case of like the Midnight Express, had great matches that were the equivalent of the top singles matches. They weren't held to this separate good for a tag team standard. And at different times of history, like at least with the Holy Demon Army, there's really not that big of a difference between what were the great singles acts and what were the great tag team acts. We're talking about the singles wrestlers for the most part who happen to be in a tag team when it comes to the HDA. But I think that's also really important. And I'm not saying the Holy Demon Army doesn't meet those standards, because they certainly do. They were a main event act. They had great matches. They drew money at the top level. So that's not the case, but it is something I think gets argued a lot with like women's wrestlers and tag teams, which is like, well, they were great, they were the best tag team, or they did this. And it's like, no, the standard is the same for all of the acts that are eligible for the Hall of Fame. We're not voting. It's not like there's a separate tag team category. Holy Demon Army are in the Japan category, and everyone who is a main big star in Japan is in that category. It's not separate. So the standard has to be the same. Who is your third? We're going really slow right now, which I kind of figured would be the case, but who is your third?
So actually that's a perfect transition into my third, actually a tag team that I want to talk about, and that's the Outsiders. So yeah. I know that there's some, when people look at Hall and Nash individually, they're like, no, they're not Hall of Famers. Like Hall, he was a main eventer sometimes on his own to mixed success, but he never really got like an extended run. When Nash got his extended run in the WWF, it did not work well. You know, worst strong WWF champion of all time is what gets brought up a lot. And then in when you look at like them individually in WCW, Hall like on his own only headlines maybe like the only one I can think of, I think, is like Uncensored '98 against Sting, where he's like in the co-main event. Nash got more main events, but it's mostly on his own as a single. It's mostly during WCW's down period in like, you know, 99 and 2000. But obviously the NWO was, you know, totally transformed WCW's business from being, you know, like this struggling promotion into, you know, the #1 promotion in the world, and really just the peak of popularity for at least for a national promotion in the US, you know, before WWF overtook them. So that gets credited to Hogan a lot, primarily, and rightfully so. Like Hulk Hogan was, you know, he's arguably the greatest draw of all time. But I do think that Hall and Nash, when you look at them together and the influence that they had on WCW's business, it really gets underrated. I think people think, oh, Hulk Hogan went there in '94 and just totally transformed WCW overnight. And that's true because like his pay-per-view events against Ric Flair and Vader did really, really well. And it definitely increased popularity. But after his feud with Vader ends at Bash at the Beach '95, so he's been in WCW for about a year. After that, not so good. Like Fall Brawl '95, which is Hogan and Savage, Sting and Luger against the Dungeon of Doom, does, you know, a little bit better than '94, which was War Games between a team led by Terry Funk and a team led by Dusty Rhodes. Like Hogan wasn't on that show in '94. Halloween Havoc '95, Hogan against the Giant, like way down from Havoc '94, which was Hogan and Flair. Starrcade '95, which Hogan wasn't on, is just like a disaster. It's one of WCW's worst pay-per-views. And then you go into '96 where Hogan versus the Giant, again, a Super Brawl, and Savage versus Flair, that's down from Hogan versus Vader. Uncensored, same thing, way down from Hogan versus Vader the year before. Slamboree, the Giant versus Sting, that's down from, I think it was the Slamboree the year before was Hogan and Savage against Vader and Flair. And then Great American Bash, that's about the same, but Luger and Giant as compared to, I think it was Savage and Flair the year before. But then, you know, the Outsiders actually have their match at Bash of the Beach '96. And, you know, Hogan ends up being surprise third man, but he wasn't advertised for that show, obviously. No one knew he was going to be there. And if you look at like the buys for that show and that buy rate, it's the best non-Hogan WCW buy rate since 1992, 4 years earlier. And if you look at total buys, just because the pay-per-view audience expands over time, if you look at total buys, it's the biggest non-Hogan WCW pay-per-view since Sting versus Flair in 1990. Sting's big coronation there. So just even without Hogan involved, that was a really hot angle. And then like just looking at some pay-per-views that happened after that, like Bash of the Beach show did more than Hogan versus Giant the month after that, which Hogan obviously was advertised for after Hogan had turned heel. Fall Brawl '96 is way up from Fall Brawl '95, even though all the principal guys were already there in '95. Hall and Nash are really the only new guys injected into that. World War III '96, which Hogan wasn't on, Hall and Nash are the primary guys in the Battle Royal. They also, the biggest advertised match other than the Battle Royal is them defending the tag titles against the Nasty Boys and Ming and Barbarian. That's way up from World War III '95, which Hogan and Savage were both on. So it goes farther than that too. Like you can look at like Slamboree '97, which is, the Flair, Piper, Kevin Green 6-man tag against Hogan, Nash, and Hall. That's way up from 96. Great American Bash, that's DDP and Savage, but then the co-main event is the Outsiders against Flair and Piper. That's way up from the year before. So I have it kind of laid out in my column, but it's basically WCW business, even with Hogan, before the Outsiders got there in 96, was tailing off quite a bit. But then they come and it totally just transforms it into this boom period. And they weren't there, obviously, as a team. They pretty much end as a team in like 1998, even though they kind of break up at Slamboree 98 and then reunite a little bit later and don't really headline any pay-per-views after that. But it's just there's a very clear before and after effect. And you can see like massive pay-per-view success with their influence, even on events that Hogan isn't on. So when I look at that, it's just like, was this team a Hall of Fame draw? Obviously they don't have the longevity that, a lot of other candidates do. But when I look at it from a pay-per-view perspective and their impact on that, it's not that much different than, someone like, let's say, Randy Orton in terms of like influencing double-digit growth for pay-per-views year over year. Like, it's not that much different. And when I look at think about positive historical significance and how much WCW's transformation meant to the industry long-term, even though it did end up dying, it's so significant historically. So they're a candidate that I find very interesting just because of how well they drew when they're together anyway, how well they drew together for a period of time and how significant they are historically.
Yeah, I think the historical significance angle, in addition to what you laid out, is kind of interesting because I think when you think about the NWO, the big thing is Hogan turned heel and everyone was interested in seeing heel Hulk Hogan. But that's not the whole scenario. It's Hogan turned heel with this radical new group that showed up that was Hall and Nash, and they were so different than anything else that was being presented in wrestling at the time, in the United States at least, that it wasn't just, oh, Hogan is now a bad guy. It was Hogan joined this group of cool guys who are doing things in wrestling that most fans hadn't seen before, jumping from WWF to WCW, acknowledging that they jumped, kind of going directly to war with the established stars on the company. It was totally different, and they deserve, if Hogan just turns heel and there's nothing else, he's not part of a group or he's part of a stable of just other people that were on WCW's roster and weren't recognized as kind of cool or hip new stars, it's not the same. And so they play a pivotal role. Obviously, is Hogan the main eventer during the peak of the NWO? Yes. Is Hogan the one wrestling Sting at Starrcade 97 where they set the record for highest buy rate? Yes, that's all Hogan. But they play a very valuable and pivotal role in creating the heel Hulk Hogan persona that has become, the iconic part of the peak of WCW. And I think that's an interesting aspect to it is they do have a historical significance case based on that measure. Them jumping to jumping from WWF to WCW changes wrestling history. It's 100% that what happens. Everyone acknowledges that. And so that's a key element in addition to the drawing argument that you laid out as far as the positive impact that they had on business.
Yeah, and one other thing that I would mention is I don't know if Hogan and Bischoff lie all the time and change their story all the time about pretty much everything. But one thing they've stayed consistent on is that Hulk Hogan was very reluctant to turn heel, as understandably, because he had been the biggest babyface in the world for, at that point, over a decade. So it's understandable that someone in that position would be like, I know things aren't going so well, but man, maybe we can heat up an angle and, business will get back on its feet, or we can start growing things again. I just need the right heel, brother. But I think what happened was Hogan saw that, oh, hey, this angle is really working. This is a really hot act. I'm going to attach myself to this. because I want to be a part of this. And without that existing, I don't know if he ever does turn heel necessarily, or if he does, maybe it's at a point where people have stopped caring already. Obviously, we get into a lot of hypotheticals there, and it's hard to, talk about that. We have to judge what did happen. But the case that I'm kind of laying out is like the outsider, like that Bash at the Beach buy rate is comparable to stuff Hogan was doing like the year before, like within the year before that. And actually, and even when Hulk Hogan wasn't involved in pay-per-views, but Hall and Nash were, they were doing really, really well. So it wasn't all Hogan. And without Hall and Nash, maybe like that doesn't none of that happens at all.
So my fourth candidate is someone we've already mentioned before, but it's Tomohiro Ishii. And the reason I find him intriguing is, as I used him as kind of an example in my edge argument, is that the argument for Ishii is solely based on how great of a worker he's been. And there's been a lot of work. You mentioned Fred Moreland's kind of statistical work looking at how well people have fared in the Wrestling Observer Awards and giving talent award shares to kind of have this kind of like metric using award voting to kind of prove consensus thought amongst hardcore fans about how good certain wrestlers actually were. And Ishii is placed very well in that. There's all sorts of data about the number of 4-star plus matches he has every year, how consistent he's been. But what makes him interesting to me is that in the Hall of Fame in general, there is hardly anybody that is in the Hall of Fame based solely on work rate. It almost doesn't exist. There are wrestlers who are in there because they were great workers, and that's their primary kind of reason they're being in, but they would at least fit the criteria in some other case to make it viable. Like AJ Styles is in primarily as a work rate candidate, but he was a main eventer for a while, and you could point to certain things. Obviously in TNA, he was the biggest star that they kind of home produced from a homegrown perspective, but did Drew do things in Japan as a draw, did do some things in WWE as a main eventer. So but he's in primarily as a work rate, but he has a little bit of that. You can look at guys like Ultimo Dragon or Rey Mysterio or Jushin Liger, who are in primarily as work rate guys, but also proposed a lot of historical significance with their style and how they kind of evolved that. Ishii doesn't really have that. He doesn't really have a drawing case at all, and he doesn't really have a historical significance case at all. He's purely on work rate, and I find that very fascinating. And he's gained, I think, some momentum. Part of it, I think, is Dave himself has kind of gone to bat talking about how Ishii deserves to be in. I think, he's kind of become a popular champion for New Japan fans to kind of point out, like, who deserves recognition? Ishii. I think part of it is he's never been IWGP World Champion. He's never going to be IWGP World Champion. He's never going to main event the Tokyo Dome. And some fans want to see him recognized in a certain way for his years of success. And part of that is maybe voting for him for the Hall of Fame. But I find him very interesting because he really would be the first candidate of his kind to get in.
Yeah, it's pretty. The only guy that I can think of that's kind of similar, but is Dynamite Kid. He did have a main event run like in Stampede.
And I think Dynamite is historically significant as a wrestler. Like,
it's hard. You can't really dispute like the positive historical significance. I mean, Chris Benoit, who also is a kind of similar candidate to some degree, is obviously like, kind of a Dynamite Kid clone. So Ishii doesn't really have the, maybe it's too soon to say. Maybe there is a bunch of people who are like going to be copying him for years to come. And you can tell he has, he has influenced some people in terms of their match structure, for sure. And he's kind of like one group that I compare him to is kind of like the Steiner brothers, at least in terms of international appeal, because like the Steiner brothers, everywhere they worked, they weren't like headliners necessarily, but they were over everywhere they worked. WCW, WWF, ECW, Japan, didn't matter. It's like Steiner brothers show up. It's like, oh shit, Steiner brothers are here. Same thing with Ishii. He shows up like anywhere in the US, AEW, some indie show. It's like, oh man, Ishii's here. People get really excited about it. Like, he's great. But I agree. He's kind of, he definitely doesn't have a drawing case, even though he headlines, occasionally. But I think one thing that's interesting is we were talking before about candidates and the number of people going in relative to era for Japan. So obviously, the modern era 2010s is very underrepresented. So even though he's only like a one criteria candidate, like I don't know, how many people are you really putting over him potentially just based on the strength of that one criteria? Like I could understand like, okay, obviously the people already in now, sure. Okada, Omega, Tanahashi, yeah, sure. But Naito, I just argued that a few minutes ago. So Naito, obviously, I could see Ibushi, but then it's like, okay, like Shingo, Shima, all right, maybe. But that starts to get a lot closer, So in that respect, I think I think he gets in for sure eventually, but he is definitely unique, compared to who is in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, he's a Dynamite Kid is the godfather of dumb jock wrestling. So he is definitely historically significant. Yeah, it just, I'm happy for him, like, but I've been really surprised like how much momentum he's gained, and that he's probably he could potentially fare better than Naito on a ballot. He could potentially fare better than Ibushi on a ballot. And those are guys with stronger drawing resumes and, in my opinion, superior in-ring. And I'm not an Ishii hater I sound like I am for his in-ring, but I think like even, and I've talked to Fred about this because Fred's big on the, Ishii is this, he's sixth all time in win shares or whatever. But if I look at the era of New Japan Pro Wrestling, let's call it New Japan in the 2010s. I don't know, like this is gonna sound like bad, but like Ishii is like maybe barely in my top 10 of when it comes to just like workers in New Japan in that era. Maybe if you could, because he's kind of spanned the entire decade of the 2010s, he's had the greatest number of matches in totality. But I'm just looking at like wrestlers from that era in ring. Who would I pick over Ishii? It's like, for me personally, and Tanahashi, Okada, Omega, Ibushi, Naito, Will Ospreay, Shinsuke Nakamura, perhaps. Nakamura's not consistent as Ishii, but I think he had a higher ceiling. So that's 7 guys right there. I don't know if I'm forgetting anyone that I would put. Shingo, I would put higher. Now that's factoring maybe his Dragon Gate work, but still. So now we're at 8. So it's like, do I want to vote in the 9th best guy from, in my opinion, again, the 9th best guy from New Japan's glory period? Like probably. He's probably better than most of the people that are in the Hall of Fame, if I'm being honest. It's just such a loaded period. But it's not like I feel like, oh, he has to be in because he finished high in these ratings. Like he's working G1s with great talent every year. And I know he can do it with lesser talent and things like that. But it's I don't see him as like the best, like close to being the best wrestler of his generation from an in-ring perspective. And that's kind of where he would have to be to me to make the Hall of Fame solely as an in-ring case.
Yeah, and I think some people do view him that way.
Yeah, and I get that.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the mix. I'm kind of in the middle between people who view him as like the best wrestler ever, arguably, and you who has him, I guess, 8th.
No, but look, when I say 8th, people will be like, "Oh, that's ridiculous, 8th." But if I were to go name by name, and I would say like, yeah, I think I think Kenny Omega is better than Tomohiro Ishii from an in-ring perspective. I think people would be like, okay, I can see that. It's just, I think it's the context of it is hard to understand, but a lot of it's just because New Japan's had such a great roster.
Yeah, I think so one thing that I find interesting is just how people evaluate like the in-ring criteria or the performance criteria in general. And that's, I place more of an emphasis on high-end work. Like, was the work you did like the best stuff of the year? Whereas I think some other voters and people who follow the Hall of Fame place more emphasis on volume and consistency of great matches, which I'm like, I think that's important in terms of just like, not sucking. But at the same time, I'm looking more like, okay, who was doing the best stuff in a given time period and what was that best stuff? So when I look at it that way, I think there's less of a variance between Ishii and his contemporaries in ring than there are between like Ishii and his contemporaries as draws. So when I'm looking at like the overall criteria and who has the stronger case, like, okay, I can see arguably Ishii being like the #1 New Japan guy from the 2010s. But then if you're evening that out as a draw with like the drawing criteria, you know, he's nowhere close to #1. So if you're averaging that out, the other candidates like Naito and Ibushi and the guys already in, like, you know, they're going to be ranked ahead of him.
Yeah, I would say right now on my Japanese ballot, if I'm looking at it, again, I only have 5, which is weak. I have Naito, I have Ibushi, and I have Takagi over him.
Ooh, interesting. Okay.
Do I vote now? Obviously, I might vote for Holy Demon Army. I haven't decided yet. So that's 4. I would like to vote for Ishii. I really would. I know I made it sound like I was a hater, but he's at least he's going to be 5th on my ballot in Japan. And you could make an argument. I don't know. I like Naomichi Marufuji. I don't want to make the argument that Marufuji's got a better resume of matches than Ishii, because he doesn't. But kind of as individual wrestlers, I kind of like Marufuji more. But Marufuji hasn't worked a bunch of G1s like Ishii has, so he doesn't have nearly the volume. I think it's an interesting point you raise about like consistency and volume of like 4-star matches versus like hitting the absolute peaks of the top end. And Ishii's had 5-star matches. He's had incredible matches that have contended for match of the year. But a big piece of the argument is that like Ishii can go out there and have a 13-minute 4-star match like clockwork, and he has a very style that he can do no matter how battered his body is and things like that. And I think a lot of people are charmed by that and appreciate that. And you would, but I'm closer to you, I think, in the sense that, like, you know, like I'm not watching every Road 2 show. If Okada is mailing in all of these 6-man tags that I'm not watching, I don't care, as long as he's having a 5-star match from the once a year pay-per-view event or main event at the big show that they're doing. That's what matters to me. But it is interesting, like the differences you can look at, like when it comes to like good matches. Are we looking at consistency? Or are we looking at the peaks? And the further we are removed from their time, the peaks will stand out. The consistency will become less relevant to people, which isn't fair necessarily.
Yeah, I agree.
It's like people aren't going to necessarily remember that Ishii had all these great G1s. People are going to remember, like, you know, maybe his 10 best matches. Who do you have as your 4th?
So that's actually amazing that you said that, because that's actually kind of a perfect segue into the next guy I wanted to talk about, and that's Bill Goldberg. So you just mentioned people remembering the peaks, okay? So when people think of Bill Goldberg, they think of he's at the Georgia Dome spearing and jackhammering Hulk Hogan, winning the championship, like the biggest gate, the biggest crowd.
On like 3-day notice, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Just like, you know, and also like drew an incredible rating that night as well. And undoubtedly in late, you know, in that like summer of 1998, I think like fall of 97 through the summer of 98 is the absolute peak of WCW. Like that's when all their biggest pay-per-views were. That's when all their biggest houses were. That's when their biggest ratings were. Like, it's absolutely the peak. But when it comes to looking at the Hall of Fame criteria from a drawing perspective, obviously Goldberg drew some houses during that period. He definitely moved ratings for his segments, which were always relatively short, by the way, but he would draw ratings for those segments. The problem where I struggle with Goldberg is, you know, I've talked about my year-over-year pay-per-view analysis, and when I look at that, like, Goldberg, he didn't headline a lot of pay-per-views in WCW, not nearly as many as you'd think. And when you think about like his peak, like it's really, he's coming up when other people are on top in WCW. Like it's already peaked basically. And then when they start they never really totally give him the ball, but like if you look at, okay, he wins the title. Bash at the Beach, he's like in a mid-card match. Like, he's not the headline. The headliner is Hogan and DDP against Karl Malone and DDP and Karl Malone against Hulk Hogan and Dennis Rodman. And then Road Wild is Hogan and Bischoff against DDP and Jay Leno. And then he doesn't even have a big match on Fall Brawl. Halloween Havoc, it's Hogan and Warrior, and then Goldberg and DDP. That pay-per-view is way down from Hogan and Roddy Piper the year before. And then Goldberg versus Nash is way down from Sting and Hogan. It's still the second biggest Starrcade ever, but it's down like over 30%. Like, it's a giant decrease. And then we get into 1999, where pretty much after Super Brawl, which is Hogan and Flair, that show does really well. But after Super Brawl 99, it's just downhill. Like the entire for the remainder of WCW's existence. So it's really a very short time period where Goldberg's like a significant draw for WCW, and you can't even, from a pay-per-view perspective, like, he's not even like a draw for WCW. Part of that is because WCW didn't necessarily put him in a position to be, but when we're looking at this, we can't judge people based on what could have happened or what should have happened. We have to judge their case on what did happen. So then Goldberg, he doesn't like do much from a drawing perspective for the remainder of WCW in 99, 2000, 2001. He goes to WWE in 2003. His debut match in Backlash is against The Rock. Okay, like, that should be like this big giant match. It's way down from the year before, which was Hogan versus Triple H. He does have some really good pay-per-views against Triple H in singles matches at like Unforgiven 03, Survivor Series 03, and then WrestleMania 20 was a giant success as well. But he's there for a year, and that's like 3 pay-per-views he headlines that do really well. And then he's gone until 2016 into 2017. Now, that run where, he's feuding with Brock Lesnar, going to the Royal Rumble, I would say that like 6-month run there is definitely like Hall of Fame quality. But when you're adding that stuff up, it amounts to like what? Like maybe like 2 years in total where he's like some sort of significant draw. And even then, not totally consistently, because he's not there all the time or every week. And then the stuff after that, like, it's mostly like Saudi shows, which I'm not counting that towards his drawing case for the Hall of Fame. So it's not that I don't think Goldberg was. I think you can definitely make a case that he was a Hall of Fame level draw, but that's really the only criteria that I think he has. And I don't think he's nearly strong enough in that to get in on that alone.
Yeah, I think that you touched on a lot of my feelings towards Goldberg too, Goldberg was my 5th person. So we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone here.
Oh, nice.
In that, I think a lot of people recollect that Bill Goldberg and Steve Austin were the 2 biggest stars of the late 90s. But they're really not comparable when it comes to how big stars they were. Goldberg's he wasn't a business mover at that level. He could have been, but he wasn't. I look at the Matt Farmer has these lists out where he did research every year, looking at who were the 10 biggest attendance draws in wrestling. And it basically calculates shows that wrestlers headlined that drew 10,000 or more fans, who was on them, and kind of ranks them top 10s every year. Bill Goldberg only finishes in the top 10 one year. It's 1998, and he finishes 6th. So if I'm voting for Bill Goldberg, whose case is solely relying on his drawing power, and it's a very short period of time, like you said, maybe you can stitch together 2 years throughout his entire career where he is like really making a big difference as a draw. And even then, he's not like the biggest star in wrestling. It's not much of a case for me. I think that he's not the kind of, it's very hard for me to vote for somebody who was only big for a couple of years. I value longevity a lot. Goldberg's closest contemporary is Dano O'Mahony, who's not on the ballot, who I would vote for. I've advocated this for Dave. He has not put him on the ballot, but Dano O'Mahony, who people don't know, was a wrestler in the 1930s and was literally the Bill Goldberg of the 1930s. Um, but Daniel O'Mahony, unlike Bill Goldberg, was the biggest star in wrestling by a wide margin when he was at his peak, which would be 1935 and 1936. He was by far the biggest star in 35 and by far the biggest star in 36. And you can say, well, Jesse, that was a million years ago. Like, what relevance does it have? And it's like, well, he unseated Jim Londos, who was maybe the biggest drawing card of all time over that stretch. Londos had been the biggest draw in wrestling for like 15 years straight. Mahoney catches fire in 35 and 36. He's number one by a wide margin. That's the kind of standard I'm looking at if I'm going to take someone with a 2-year run as a top star. It's like you have to be the biggest star without question. And the evidence for Goldberg really isn't there. Like I said, he could have been, but it wasn't. And I think it's, the really interesting thing with Goldberg is you could say, oh, well, okay, he finished 6th. He wasn't as big of a star as Steve Austin or The Rock or Hulk Hogan. Those are like the 3 biggest stars ever. So just because you're 4th or whatever, or 6th in a super loaded era, that should still mean that you should get in. But you can't untwine those 2 aspects in the sense that part of the reason Bill Goldberg became Bill Goldberg, and because he was such a big star, was because he was in a hot period of wrestling. And if Bill Goldberg came along now or a few years ago when wrestling was in a much worse shape and there wasn't this kind of momentum and the companies weren't hot, he wouldn't have been as successful as he ended up being. Part of the reason he got over so big was because part of the reason he drew the big crowd to the Georgia Dome was because he was wrestling Hulk Hogan, and Hogan was really over as a heel at the time, and people wanted to see him beat him. You can't just say, oh, well, he was sharing it. He wasn't as big as Hulk Hogan. That's because, Hogan's the biggest star ever. So therefore, that shouldn't be held against him. And it's like, well, part of the reason he became such a big star was because he happened to be peak at a perfect time for him. And so you can't just dismiss one aspect of the argument in favor of and use another part of it as a favorable comp. To me, it's a really something you can't separate between the two. And to me, he's just not. I think his drawing power exists in the imaginations of fans from that era in a way that I don't think exists on paper. And as the further we get away from his peak as an individual star, the harder it's going to be to kind of make an argument for him, I think.
Well, I think it's just people remember his peak and they don't remember exactly the context.
Yeah, I mean, that's
one of the reasons.
That's helpful what you pointed out with the context of, like, it's not like he was this gigantic consistent star from the first match he had against Hugh Morris until Kevin Nash or Scott Hall hit him with a cattle prod at Starrcade 98. It's much more nuanced than that. It's a lot more up and down.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons I advocated for the outs, even though their time frames aren't that much similar in terms of like what their time as draws. One of the reasons I kind of advocated for the outsiders, but I'm kind of advocating against Goldberg, is that the outsiders took a promotion that was struggling, and then it turned into like one of the hottest promotions that has ever existed for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. Whereas Goldberg came in when that promotion was already peaking, and then was on top during the down period. And I'm not saying like he was on top in 99 when it totally fell apart. I'm saying he's on top in late 98 as it starts to go down. So it's just, if he had a longer career, I could definitely envision, voting for him. But it's just his time where he really was drawn is just so short. It's so short. And it's not like he's WCW's biggest draw ever. He could have been, and maybe he should have been, but that's not how reality turned out. And then, when he goes to WWE a few years later, he doesn't have this instant, like, and obviously WWE wasn't super hot anyway, but you'd think if Goldberg really was like one of the biggest draws of all time, when he came into WWE, even though they had been falling off a bit, he should have like set that place on fire. And that's not what happened. It took him like 6 months to like start doing like big pay-per-views. And even then he only did a couple of them.
Yeah. I think, the thing with the kind of the WCW guys in WWF in the early 2000s. And this is a kind of the whole invasion angle kind of follows this same thing, is in hindsight, we can look back and be like, Bill Goldberg versus Steve Austin, or no, Bill Goldberg versus The Rock, dream match. Fans would love to see that. But this is also a fan base that had been taught to hate the enemy, that had been taught to dislike WCW. And that's what happened when a lot of the WCW guys came in. Guys who should have been stars and guys that had tons of potential were being faced with this hurdle of being branded as WCW guys, both to fans and in the locker room. And it submarined a lot of promising stars in WCW. And it really took time for WCW to kind of, the ashes to finally go out in WCW until these guys kind of got over. By the time Goldberg comes back to WWE, a few years ago, nostalgia has set in. People are kind of past the tribalism of the Monday Night Wars, but that was still something that was very much alive in the early 2000s. And for guys like Hulk Hogan, who were established WWE guys before going to WCW, it wasn't difficult at all for them to kind of come back into the company. But for people like Goldberg, for people like DDP, for people like Booker T, it was a real challenge to kind of get over when you're coming in as like the WCW guy who's, this inferior wrestler from this dead company that we've been taught to hate. And the WCW fans who are big Goldberg fans aren't necessarily tuning into Raw to see Goldberg and The Rock interact because they're done, that their company is closed. They're not going to watch the enemy with enjoying the spoils of victory. As nostalgia sets in, that stuff fades away. But at the time, that's what existed. I think, this Dave gets asked this question like once a week, it feels like, which is why didn't they do Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 8 instead of Hogan and Sid? Yeah, and Dave always says like Hogan versus Sid was hotter at the time, which sounds absurd in hindsight. That Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, like first time on pay-per-view WrestleMania, that should be the defining wrestling match of history. Why didn't it happen at WrestleMania? And it's like Flair came in, and Flair was WCW guy, the guy that was part of this other wrestling company that fans maybe didn't always follow back then. And it's hard to kind of, in hindsight, it sounds absurd now in 2022 to say that, but that was how wrestling was presented back then. And I think it becomes harder to analyze that the further we get away from it.
Yeah, with that one in particular, they just I think the problem with that was they turned Flair into just another heel as opposed to being like the greatest wrestler in the world.
Right. He wasn't presented as this megastar, but even then, I mean, there's plenty of guys who were huge stars and they get to WWF. Maybe they're a little bit older in their careers or whatever, but they're not the same kind of draws as they were when they were big stars in the territories. And a lot of that comes down to.
Yeah, that's true.
The fan bases were not
a lot of that's
same.
Presentation.
Yeah, part of it is presentation.
With Goldberg, though, I think like obviously it's like, oh, they screwed him up. They put the gold dust wig on him, and there is definitely some truth to that they didn't book him the right way. But for that match with The Rock, he just got there. They haven't screwed him up yet. Mm-hmm. It's his first match there. Like if he was like this absolute megastar hey, at the time I was a big Goldberg fan. I still am a Goldberg fan, but at the time I was a giant Goldberg fan and I was really excited he was there. But a lot of people just didn't share that. To your point, I think a lot of the WCW fans did go away. The first Invasion pay-per-view did incredible business, but after that, yeah, like I think a lot of them just got run off based on the way they treated Booker T and DDP and guys like that. And so maybe there was just, we do like Goldberg and we care about him, but we're not going to, we know they're probably going to screw it up, which they kind of did. So we're not even going to bother. So maybe that did play a role into it. But again, it's unfortunate that all happened and Goldberg wasn't fully used to his potential. But again, we can't, judge like what should have happened or what could have happened. We have to look at what did happen.
Who do you have as your fifth and final candidate?
To probably the surprise of no one who knows me, CM Punk is.
I thought we were going to make it the entire way without talking about CM Punk. I was like, I did a 2-hour Hall of Fame podcast with Adam, and we didn't talk about CM Punk. What a miracle! Yeah, no,
got to talk about him. Yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start. Actually, how about before I go into my whole spiel, which, you know, anyone who knows me or follows me on anything has probably heard before. What are your thoughts and feelings on CM Punk this year?
So I didn't vote for CM Punk last year. And I felt like I could have, but I was like, I could read the tea leaves in 2021. And I said, he's going to win the title in 2022. He's going to get a big title run. Let's hold off. Let's not vote for him here. Let's vote for it. Let's see, you know, what he does in 2022. I'll feel very confident about voting for him in 2022 because we'll have a longer track record of him drawing. I was not a voter of him previous to his return to wrestling in AEW. So it was really what he was going to do in AEW, I think, was going to have a big influence on whether I was going to vote for him or not. And so he, you know, he had done this time last year, he had done the big, return. He had done the rampage at the United Center. They had done the big all out rating. He was clear that he was having a really positive impact on business. And I was like, I could vote for him, but let's get a little bit. I know if I wait a year, we'll get more sample size of his return. We'll see how long this kind of momentum can last. We can see what he's doing a year after his return from a business perspective. We'll get a lot more insight on how he's doing. And there's no rush to vote him in now. But halfway through last year, you know, he had won the title, you know, business was still doing well. And I was like, Jesse, you played this right. I'm going to feel so good about voting for him at the end of the year because I waited, I got the evidence I need. I'm going to vote for him. I didn't rush anything. My instincts were correct. I was super happy. Then All Out happened. Then the press conference happened. Then the fight happened. Then the now smear campaign has gone on. And now I don't know what to do, Adam. I don't know if I want to vote for him. I'm very interested in seeing how much his actions and his behavior over the last few months how much of that does it have a negative impact on AEW? If it does, that might make me reconsider what he's accomplished in AEW, which sounds kind of strange to say, but it's everything with him is so up in the air right now that I don't know if I want to vote for him. I kind of want to wait another year. But from a resume standpoint, if we just look at what he's done as a star, as a draw, as a performer, yes, he's in. But I still feel like there's this dark potential for him to take some things off of the table, and I want to wait on it.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'll just say it's the Hall of Fame. It's not the Hall of Good Guys.
But that doesn't bother me. I would have voted to keep Benoit in if I was a voter at the time. That stuff I don't think that stuff really bothers me. It's more of, does his behavior have a negative impact on AEW's business? Does it sour?
Sure, but there's two ways of looking at that though. You can be like, oh, AEW went down because of his behavior, or did AEW go down because he's not there anymore? Mm-hmm. That was one thing that we saw in the summer. And maybe that would have happened anyway, but we don't know. But like, he gets hurt, and then the ratings go down during the summer after that big LA show, after the pay-per-view. And then, he comes back, has that match with Moxley, the squash match, which did great ratings, for that segment. And then the All Out pay-per-view, tanked. Obviously, they were never going to do the 200,000 buys that they were going to do before, that CM Punk did last year. But it was below, it was below Double or Nothing. It was below Revolution. It was even below Full Gear. It was basically below everything that Punk had been on before. But when I look at that, I don't look at that as everyone, nobody liked CM Punk. Well, at least the fans still like CM Punk because that Moxley match did draw well in the ratings. I think they just did a squash match and they didn't have enough time to set up a rematch to get people really interested in it. So that's how I kind of analyzed the All Out buy rate. But with Punk, I think at this point, his case is I think his last year, he kind of proved what he needed to prove. That All Out buy rate was up over 100% from the year before, which is just an insane number. His debut Rampage segment, if you look at I think it was his demo average for his segment when he was on Rampage, it outdrew SmackDown, the average for SmackDown for that aired that same night, even though SmackDown was on primetime on Fox. and Punk is on after 10 p.m. on cable. Like his segment where he was out there had a higher demo rating than the average for that SmackDown episode that same night, which is just insane.
And this was like the second or third Rampage where there really hadn't been any familiarity established with the brand or the time slot at all. It was literally just like a random time for a wrestling that no one knew about, but there was a rumor that CM Punk was going to be there.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then in terms of like he was always one of you and Brandon talking on WrestleNomics, was CM Punk a draw? You looked at his impact on ratings that he had, and it was pretty clear that he was. If you look at like his other buy rates, Revolution, where him and MJF are, there's debate if whether him and MJF were the primary drawing cards or Hangman and Adam Cole. I think it's fair to say it was a mix of both, for sure. Punk being the most popular guy amongst those four at the time based on Google Trends. But that was up, over 30% from the year before. His match with Hangman at Double or Nothing, that was up over 30% from the year before. Like these are big numbers. And a lot of the talk with CM Punk, there's like questions about his like longevity. And I'll just point this out. I'm finishing up my column, so hopefully it'll be out by next week, my year-over-year pay-per-view analysis. But I have Punk at, and again, I'm looking at not necessarily just the last match on the card. So it could be like, one of the two best matches, unless there's one that's clearly like the primary drawing card. But in terms of year over year of 10% growth or more, I have Punk at 11 events that he was involved in headlining with more than 10%. The only other person with double digits for like 10 or more that isn't in the Hall of Fame is Kevin Nash. And he has a lot more failures. And as we just talked about, a lot of that was him teaming with Hall or teaming with Hogan, and his individual drawing record isn't nearly as great. Also, in terms of total pay-per-view events that Punk's headlined, it's very comparable to Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle. So obviously, maybe in terms of time frames, his time on top was a little bit truncated, but he was headlining a lot more regularly than a lot of guys were. So that's a couple of things I'd point out. And then in terms of like quality work and like how many years he put in quality work, I mean, he was placing top 5 in the Observer Awards in 2003, 2004, 2005 for his Ring of Honor work. His time in OVW, obviously, and his early WWE run, he's not placing. But then he starts placing in the top 5 again in 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13. So we're up to 8 years right there. And then he comes back in 2021 and 2022. So he's got like 10 calendar years where he's doing some of the best work of the year. So the longevity aspect at this point, I don't really think that's a valid criticism at all. I think he's proven that, especially if you're counting promo work into the performance category, he's one of the best promos of his generation, and arguably he could be the best promo of his generation.
And that's a key thing, because again, the performance criteria is about excelling in one's field in pro wrestling. It's not just in ring. And I think if you were to ask people about CM Punk as in-ring worker, I think everyone would say at a minimum that he was pretty solid. I think you'll see some variance in some people thinking he was like one of the best in-ring workers in the world at his peak. Other people might say that he was just okay, but as a promo guy, I mean, I think nobody would dispute that he's one of the best promos of the last 15 years. That's really hard to dispute, no matter what you think about him as a performer. I mean, that should be considered. I think an interesting aspect of Punk's Hall of Fame case specifically, this only matters to his Hall of Fame case. It really doesn't matter to anything else, is that you look at the business he's been able to do with AEW, the success, the huge, you talked about the All Out numbers, the consistent pay-per-view numbers he was able to drive, all this interest that he drove up. So much of that interest, especially the Rampage number and the United Center sellout and the first All Out match, so much is that tied into the fact that he wasn't wrestling for like 7 years, and he was just a ghost for 7 years. And he kind of created all of this anticipation for his return to wrestling. And should that be celebrated? Should that be the fact that he removed himself from wrestling for 7 years? Basically because he just didn't feel like wrestling. And I'm not saying like he should have wrestled or anything like that. He didn't have the passion for wrestling. He didn't want to do it. That's fine. But the 7 years, like, so he gets credit for doing these huge business numbers for this year he came back and wrestled in AEW. But if you were to compare him to someone like Randy Orton, who didn't do numbers, didn't see big, huge jumps in business like Punk did, but at the same time was a consistent performer for 7 years. And yeah, he got stale over those 7 years. And yeah, he became less interesting over those 7 years, but he was there working, main eventing shows, anchoring quarter hours, doing all of these things that you would want if you're a promoter, if you want to have a top star, just the consistency at that level. And I think it's an interesting philosophical question of whether, like, yeah, Punk drew all these big numbers, but he also disappeared for 7 years. And should that be like, does that kind of like should he get all this credit for these big, huge numbers if we also don't look at like, hey, you know, this guy was really out of it for a long time. Now, if you add up his AEW run and his previous WWE run, and like you said, the longevity is not as much of a concern. But I do kind of think, like, if I was a promoter and I was looking at these two, like Randy Orton and CM Punk, which one would I rather have if I'm a promoter? Like regardless of how you personally feel about their abilities, Punk, like just from a business perspective, yeah, Punk will do huge business for you, but he's not going to be there as much. Randy Orton's going to do less business and he might get stale and some fans might get bored of him, but he's going to be really consistently good. It's kind of like an argument of whether, like, you would rather have like, I don't know, like Sammy Sosa in your lineup, or who's going to hit 60 home runs 3 different seasons, but also not be as nearly consistent, versus having someone like, I don't know, Jeff Bagwell or someone who's going to be consistent, maybe not reach the same heights, but be better over the long run. And if you were a baseball manager, who would you rather have in the consistency? And again, it, like, as CM Punk's career doesn't really matter, but I find it just something that's, and again, that's so unique to Punk, right? It's Goldberg. We talked about Goldberg kind of like,
well,
built nostalgia, but
what happened when Edge came back?
Right, Edge didn't move interest the way that Punk did, and part of it was that Edge wasn't like existing in like this completely removed from wrestling sphere. He had his career ended through injury. He didn't storm out of the company. He didn't.
I don't think it's that. Here's what I'll recommend you do. Use Google Trends, put CM Punk, Randy Orton, Edge, Chris Jericho, just look at them for the US over, like, since, I think you can go back to like 2004. Go back to 2004, look at the fluctuations. I know that Edge was on top when WWE was bigger than when CM Punk was on top, but I'll just say the public interest in CM Punk was always, at least in terms of, you know, when they started headlining, and even retroactively, like comparing when Punk was headlining to like when Edge was headlining, and when Edge came back, like the interest in Punk was always a lot higher than a lot of his contemporaries. And another thing that kind of backs that up is for Punk's UFC fight that he did,
right,
he drew an extra 150,000 buys. And I'm going to clarify this. I'm not saying that Punk on the UFC drew 150,000 buys. I'm saying the show did more than 150,000, but if you look at who the headliners are on that show were, like what the buys that their previous fights did and what their fights after that show did, it's very clear that Punk was the variable that caused that show to draw 150,000 extra buys. Obviously, that's not as much as like Brock Lesnar drew for the UFC, and Punk was a horrible MMA fighter, and his second fight meant absolutely nothing. But that's just kind of another data point that shows, okay, this guy just did mean a lot. Like, he didn't like totally transform WWE's business, and a lot of that had to do with their creative at the time. although he did have a lot of success there, as I kind of pointed out earlier. But just like in terms of like star power and the number of people who cared about him and were interested in what he was doing, that was a lot higher than a lot of his contemporaries who are also on the ballot or who are already in the Hall of Fame.
We can induct him in the Kazushi Sakuraba wing of the Hall of Fame for like mixed MMA and wrestling accomplishments, if that's what you want to do.
Oh no.
No, well, like for his UFC career, like he was a big enough draw for UFC to get a second fight, even though he clearly showed in the first fight that he wasn't really up to the caliber of fighting that needed that, like from a competitive aspect, but he meant enough to business for them to kind of put him on as a gimmick again. And but again, okay, so like the Google search fluctuation, like he's obviously Edge didn't move numbers the way that CM Punk did. That's cool. Like, I'm not arguing that Edge was a bigger star than CM Punk at all, but I do think that like from like a performance standpoint, like he artificially increased the interest in his big matches for All Out and for his return to wrestling in a way that no other wrestler has really been able to do. No one exited with the level of controversy that he did, that then kind of kept alive in today's modern media environment with podcasts and news sites and everything like that. And it's kind of, I don't really like, I can't like, I don't want to knock him for like, oh, well, I'm not like the All Out pay-per-view buy number doesn't matter. Like, obviously it matters, but it's just such an interesting conundrum that it's like, should like it now, and one of the reasons I wanted to wait a year and not vote for him last year was for that reason, which is like, what does his staying power look like as a draw? And I think he proved himself that no other pay-per-view came close to that All Out number, but he was still a consistent enough draw on pay-per-view. He was consistently moving quarter hours. He was consistently moving attendance numbers throughout the year, that it was clear that he was still a draw. Really, he was the biggest drawing card in wrestling. If you just look at like, what individual are we putting on a show that's making a big difference? Bigger than Roman Reigns. He was bigger than Brock Lesnar. He was bigger than Seth Rollins, anyone in WWE. Like CM Punk's presence would make a bigger difference on shows than any of those guys. And that's, he probably should have won. Dave likes to not do biggest box office draw. He likes to mix in MMA guys, which is stupid, but like CM Punk should have won biggest box office draw last year. For his performance in the second half of 2021. He could probably win it in 2022, but that's not going to happen. It's probably going to go to like, I don't know, Kamaru Usman or somebody. But it's a really interesting case. I don't think he's going to get in this year, Adam. I think he's still going to come up short.
I mean, I don't think he's going to get in this year. I think maybe eventually he will. I think a lot of voters are just like, I don't like him now after his performance.
I don't think a lot of the voters are going to care that much about like that.
Well, my counterpoint to that would be, look at the death bumps that happen every year. You could say that's because, people read more about they read the obituary and understand more about the career. But I think there's definitely some emotional attachment.
Oh, I think there's emotional attachment to people voting for people that they really like and like enjoyed as performers and things like that. But I don't know if it goes the other way, where if someone really doesn't like someone, like from a personality standpoint, or someone's annoyed with what CM Punk has done from personality standpoint, I don't know how much that will impact the voting base. I think it definitely goes the street where it's like, this person's my childhood favorite. Of course I got to vote for them. Or I'm a huge fan of this territory, so I'll blindly vote for whoever is associated with this territory, so we can make sure that, Brad Armstrong is getting, or not Brad Armstrong, Bob Armstrong's getting a Hall of Fame.
Bob, yeah. Brad Armstrong I would love to see someone make a case for Brad Armstrong.
Well, real quick, because
love Brad Armstrong.
Real quick, the non-wrestler category, which we haven't got into at all because none of us had our picks. But when I was I did a write-up for Voices of Wrestling, kind of looking at all the non-wrestler candidates, and what really occurred to me is that, to me, the people that are the most worthy of induction are just really boring people to vote for, that people are not going to have an emotional attachment to. Someone like Bobby Bruns, who trained Ricky Dozan and was the original promoter of wrestling in Japan in a lot of ways, and is like super historically significant for like basically all of Japanese pro wrestling, descending from his training of Rikidozan, like has like the best case to get in, but nobody wants to vote for Bobby Bruns when you can vote for Tony Schiavone, or you can vote for Dave Brown, or these people that have like, fans are going to have like emotional connections with. And like it becomes harder because the non-wrestler category, we're for the most part not looking at drawing records. We're not looking at like excellent in-ring work, because they're not in-ring workers. It's really going by like more like your gut and going by personal preference. And that's why it's like almost impossible for the non-wrestlers to get in. I think I looked at the numbers. It's like, since they've been balloting, that's like under 20 non-wrestlers have been voted into the Hall of Fame, which is less than one per year. And it's just too hard for these guys to generate enough. There's such a wide diversity of people on the ballot in the non-wrestler category. It's really hard for one person to get 60%. It's really kind of a difficult way to assess things.
Yeah, I read your column and I did really like it. You made great cases for all the guys that you picked to vote for. The only guy that I don't think it's controversial necessarily, but I know Ted Turner is kind of, it's like, oh, he wasn't really involved in wrestling. It's like, okay, yeah, he wasn't running the day to day, but he was the one making the decisions to keep WCW around when it was a total money pit. And if you look at, like, that was him personally making.
Oh, Adam, I've read Ted Turner's autobiography. I'm very aware of this.
So he's the guy who was keeping it around. And if you just look at the criteria of historical significance in a positive manner, I mean, where is wrestling without Ted Turner? If he just is just like, yeah, get rid of this. I don't like it. I don't want it anymore. Like in 1990, like yes. Where does it, like, what even happens to it?
And this is the glory of the non-wrestler category, which is that I don't disagree with anything you just said, Adam. And I totally understand why people are like, Ted Turner has to be in. It's incontrovertible. Like, he has to be in. But for me, it's like, well, like Ted Turner, like, is not like a wrestling guy. And he wasn't hands-on enough in the wrestling business. He had a huge impact on the wrestling business because he happened to be a very powerful media tycoon. But he himself is like, I feel weird voting for him, who wrestling is not one of the 100 most important things going on in his life. And like, I'm going to vote for him. I'm not going to vote for like Mike Tenay, who's a wrestling lifer, or Larry Matisic, who did a million different various things, and wrestling was his life. It's totally like a philosophical disagreement on what this Hall of Fame is and who it's designed to honor, and who it is, what it is designed to do. And that's the non-wrestler category. You can argue about that, like, philosophically, way more than you can argue about the individual wrestlers, because that's much more cut and dry. And it's what makes the non-wrestler category so interesting, and personally probably the funnest to debate, because you can't be analytical about it. You can't be analytical about it. It's all like personal feelings and like and how people evaluate things. It also suffers from some of the candidates just being too old and just not having the kind of passionate vocal fan base that can advocate for them. I think that's a key factor. And it's going to hurt like some of these guys. It hurts guys on the historical, like if you look at the historical nominations this year, and I think the Freebirds are supposed to be on historical. Dave sent out the email and put the Freebirds in US modern, but I think by all definitions.
What do you mean? The Freebirds are already in. Do you mean
not the Freebirds? I'm sorry, the Von Erichs. No, yeah. Thanks, good catch. But if you look at the historical category, we're talking about guys whose careers ranged from people who peaked in the 1930s and 40s to guys who peaked in the late 1980s.
The Rockers and the Heart Foundation are on it now, like right. The British Bulldogs. Like they're in the. We have guys from the 80s and early 90s now who are in the historical.
Yeah, category. And it's only going to get like it's going to be a wake up call when some of those Attitude Era names slip into the historical category. But it's one of those things where I think guys who were too old from too long ago, it's not just that I think some of the voters just aren't going to do the legwork to research some of these names. I think you don't have the passionate people advocating for them to get in at the
maybe
same
you
rate.
maybe you make maybe you make another historical category where it's like 30 years before that, and then you're only with, and then that lowers the voting pool
Well,
for
Dave
it.
does this very interesting thing where he will just put people in the Hall of Fame without putting them on the ballot. And he will use the argument that no one is going to vote for these people because they're too old. And we're talking a lot of cases like wrestlers from the 1800s or the early
Yes, I
1900s.
remember that.
And he's like, look, no one's going to vote for these people. It's not fun to vote for them. I'm just going to put them in. I'd like to see him extend that to some people. I think he should just put more Siegel in. No one wants to vote for the Houston wrestling promoter from the 1930s and 40s. I get it. But like, I having done the research, I'm like, more Siegel's gotta be in. And Dave will write, more Siegel's gotta be in. Bobby Bruns has gotta be in. Bobby Davis to me has to be in. But they were peaked so long ago, all their cases more than 50 years ago now. Like they're not going to have
Yeah,
the fans arguing for them the same way that wrestlers from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into today have. And I think Dave has toyed with the concept of like a veterans committee, like establishing a committee of like 12 historians to kind of maybe vote in, which is what some other sports have done. Baseball and football, I know, have kind of like this committee to kind of look at guys who peaked so long ago. But I think I don't even like that as much because I think it's going to be very political, and you're going to get someone who loves one territory on the
well,
committee. And
sure. Well, I mean, I don't know, I just came out, I didn't put a lot of thought into it, but you could just make an older voting category.
Mhm.
So then like because at that point, it's like, the category is only going to be researching people like way before your
Yeah,
lifetime,
and if you don't
And
vote
so then
if you choose not to vote in a category, your vote you do not count as the block to get someone in. So it's only the 60% in that category, which is important. So you would get people who don't care. That's a good point. Like you get people who don't care, who will just skip over that category, and the people you will get will theoretically be the people who are going to dive into the numbers and are going to be really looking at who should get in the most part. And this is why I don't really vote that many people in from the historical category, because I see them all, even the best candidates in that category are all really fringe candidates to me. Like, I think they've done a good job catching the biggest stars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think that's been well established. There are people on there like Sergeant Slaughter or Junkyard Dog. Some of those guys might be in the modern category. But to me, it's like there's nothing egregious here. It's not like, Nick Bockwinkel's not in the Hall of Fame. I do feel that way with some of these guys going further back, like Morris Siegel and Bobby Davis. Like Bobby Davis should have been in the inaugural class, realistically, but he wasn't. People forgot about him. He only really got on the ballot because he died last year. And it's going to be a struggle for him to get in, despite the fact that he was this hugely pioneering manager and all of this stuff, and is historically significant in a bunch of different ways. But it's definitely should be interesting results. I think it's going to be hard for a lot of talent to get in due to the adding a lot of the tag teams and making the ballot a little bit bigger. And I think maybe Dave is going to continue to make adjustments to the voting process.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It is interesting that you can vote for 8 candidates in the historical, but only 5 everywhere else. So that was something that I thought
because
was
I think he added more
kind
tag
of
teams.
interesting.
There's a lot more tag teams in the historical, and he's looking at as like those are gonna put things over the top. I mean, he has a bunch of tag teams in here. A lot of them I haven't heard many people talk about, despite the fact that they might have good cases. Like, British Bulldogs, obviously they'll get some talk, but like no one's talking about Harley Race and Larry Hennig, and no one's talking about the Texas Outlaws, Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch. Like that those guys might deserve to get in. Those tag teams very well might deserve to get in based on drawing and based on quality of work in certain cases. But man, it's going to be hard to vote for them all. And it's again, I kind of have it's just almost easier for me mentally to just be like, I'm not voting for any of these tag teams Dave just threw on the ballot. I just want to I want the ballot to be simpler in my mind. So I'm just going to disregard them. But that's probably not the right course of action.
Well, I think it's like you said, a lot of these tag teams are one guy who's already in the Hall of Fame because he's an indisputable giant draw and big star. And then, he was in a tag team for a while with a guy who might have been good, but was much less of a star.
Yeah.
So,
And,
like I was saying, based on the other guys' contributions, did that make the team
yeah.
Really strong and really special?
Well, like the Texas Outlaws, like Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch are really interesting in the sense that tag team exists before Dusty Rhodes is like Dusty Rhodes, the mega star that people remember. So it's a heel Dusty Rhodes for starters. It's a much different stage of his career, and he isn't Dusty Rhodes yet the way that like Rocca and Perez are. Like Perez is tagging with Rocca when he's already been a star for 10 years and been owning Madison Square Garden for 10 years. Like so each of these come with their own kind of different nuanced cases. The big thing for me, the historical guys, is I really think, like, unless there's somebody on here who's really egregious, I trust the voting base that has come before me to have made all decisions on these guys in a lot of ways. I don't want to be the new guy who comes in and is like, yeah, I'm voting for this guy, when it's like, you know what? Like Sergeant Slaughter is a good example. Like, I get the arguments for Slaughter. I've read a lot about him, but at the same time, I'm like, you know what? Historians and journalists and wrestlers that worked with him, wrestlers that were retired with him, whatever, they've all been looking at Sergeant Slaughter these last 15 years, 14 years he's been on the ballot. And they've said, I don't think he's a Hall of Famer. And it's like, who am I to come in and just be like, Sarge is a Hall of Famer. I love Sergeant Slaughter. Unless I feel really strongly about a case. I feel really strongly about Johnny Rougeau, Jacques Rougeau. So that's the guy who gets my one vote, because I feel like his career has been overlooked. I think the fact that he wrestled in the 60s, his peak was in the 60s, which is a little bit older than the voting base is going to be able to recognize in a lot of cases. The fact that he wrestled in a company that didn't speak the English was not the primary language. And the fact that his video library was not bought by WWE, which makes it, from historical reasons, much more difficult to find. His work hasn't aged the same way that, like, I feel like a national star like Sergeant Slaughter or Junkyard Dog or Harley Race Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Like, I feel like those guys have gotten a fair shake for the most part in a lot of cases. But that's just an overall philosophy that I have. I mean, Sarge, it's his last year on the ballot. He's gotten very close. I think he got very close last year. He might get in this year because generally people do the best when it's the last year on the ballot. So,
I would say, I don't know. I would say if you're borderline on him, maybe, push him in so you can vote for other people. If he's one of those guys that you're pretty close on.
Well, I wouldn't vote for him for his stolen valor. That's for sure.
Fair enough. Gotta have standards. Gotta draw the line somewhere.
All right. This is ticking up. This is the longest, I think, podcast we've ever done on here. But the listeners will like it. This is a hot topic. Do you have anything you want to plug?
No, I'll just say, pay attention to Voices of Wrestling. I'll have the column that I referenced a few times throughout this conversation up relatively soon, hopefully by sometime next week. And feel free to dig into the numbers, look at the spreadsheets. And let me know. You can hit me up on Twitter if you don't, which Jesse will plug when he posts the show, I think. But you can hit me up and let me know if you don't agree with who I said headlined certain shows, or if I was too hard on poor Edge or Randy Orton with assigning blame. But overall, I think the ballot's really interesting this year, and fascinated to see what the results will be.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Adam. We appreciate having you on, and we'll see everyone again next time.